Due to copyright, I can't publish many audiobooks on YouTube. At our audiobook novel service, we offer access to over 300 full novels from Pocket FM, Webnovel, Audible, Wuxia, and more, all in high-quality audio format. Each novel is available with a one-time payment only. No subscriptions, no monthly payment, and no ads. Payments via PayPal or Ko-fi. To browse the full list of available novels, message me directly on Telegram or WhatsApp, or check out our full catalog on Discord. Chapter 841. Responsibility and Preservation. Northern and everyone else tensely awaited Elidas' response, causing a grave silence to fall over the room, even if just for a few seconds. The shopkeeper exhaled, his gaze meeting Paragon Rizel's with steady confidence. Yet his smile, solemn and unmoving, refused to truly live. Then he responded, "Well, you are indeed right. I have considered such cases, and particularly before meeting this strange client, seeing how he knew exactly where to seek me." Paragon Rizel grinned. "So he was pretty sus, huh?" Elidas responded evenly, "He was." The man took a small pause, exhaling deeply before resuming. "However, it will take me a little bit of time to do anything regarding this issue, and I most certainly cannot do anything here." Paragon Rizel remained silent even after Elidas had spoken. His gaze had dropped to the ground, eyes slightly unfocused, while his foot tapped in absent rhythm. A moment later, he raised his head and stared at the shopkeeper. "That's fine. The main purpose of this meeting was to figure out how to get the hell out of this damn place." With that, he turned his head toward Northern, Ascendant Zion, and Sage Mac. "Anyone here brimming with divine revelations on how to escape this city, with its civilians intact, and not get eviscerated before reaching the warmth of safety, however far that may be?" Northern studied the man for a few seconds. Then his gaze sharpened slightly. "I want to understand you." He paused for barely a breath before continuing. "You want to escape this city with all its civilians? Not just yourself, but all of them?" The Paragon grinned crookedly at Northern and nodded. "Why? Does it sound like gibberish to you?" Northern frowned, tilting his head slightly. "It doesn't to you?" Paragon Rizel shrugged. "Sounds perfectly sane to me." He threw a glance at Ascendant Zion and Sage Mac. "Or what do you guys think?" Ascendant Zion remained silent, but Sage Mac exhaled before responding, "Although it's a bit of wishful thinking, it is expected. We can't just leave these people behind and escape on our own." Paragon Rizel's smile widened with satisfaction. He gestured grandly, emphasizing Sage Mac's words. "Right? Rather expected. Stars forbid I'd ever care about my own skin more than the powerless." Northern squinted slightly. Was he defective? Northern simply did not understand why anyone would put the safety of people they did not even know before their own. Yet, at that moment, Paragon Rizel seemed to be studying him, really studying him, as if he had dived into his mind. Then, with an almost annoyingly appealing voice, the man spoke. "Oh, and make no mistake, Ral. The only reason I have a responsibility to protect these people is simply because I can. You don't need any extra pep talks about heroism." His voice was casual, but his words struck deeply. "In fact, there's nothing heroic about the involvement of death, especially when it's your own. Saving your skin and caring only about yourself is selfish, yes, but that's a decision no one should hold against you. After all, we already live in a selfish world." The Paragon grinned mischievously. Northern, however, frowned. "Then what is it about, if it isn't heroism?" Paragon Rizel's gaze locked onto him, his expression turning more serious, more weighty. His next words fell with the force of that weight. "Responsibility." Northern's frown got darker. "Responsibility." The Paragon nodded, his grin lingering. "That makes even less sense than before," Northern muttered. "So you're responsible for them just because you're a Paragon? And yet you claim it's not an act of heroism? To me, this just sounds like another way of saying heroism, without actually using the word." Paragon Rizel shook his head. "Ral, heroism is good, there's nothing wrong with it. But heroism is selfless. Responsibility, on the other hand, is a necessity. He leaned forward slightly, his voice steady, unwavering. It's how we save what little is left of our rotten world. He paused for a moment, allowing the words to settle before continuing. For every one person who awakens the power of a star, 10 others do not. A historic scholar, a philosopher who studied the constellations and their passive existence, once postulated that 10 souls are sacrificed to build the potency of one. Reisel's voice remained firm, yet there was something almost detached about the way he spoke. The world already revolves around drifters, abandoning the ancient humanity. If drifters do not deem themselves responsible for humans, then at some point in the future humans will perish like insignificant insects. And when that happens, fewer and fewer drifters will awaken, because the ordinary 10 souls meant to fuel the birth of a stellar one will no longer exist. Northern fell silent. For several seconds he thought about what the Paragon had said. Philosophers, of course, had always existed in history. He had come across many of them, drifters burdened by an unexplainable weight, tethered to the mundanity of humanity. They cared too deeply for the powerless, mourning the way the society neglected them. So Northern wasn't ruling out the possibility that such a philosophy had been created as a way to impose a sense of importance onto mundane humans. But as much as Northern wanted to dismiss the Paragon's words, they made sense, at least in a pragmatic consideration of that postulated theory. Drifters held immense value. Nations and governments wouldn't hesitate to sacrifice 1 million mundane humans if it meant saving a single Paragon. Especially if that Paragon had the power to protect them, mundane or not. Paragon Reisel's explanation of responsibility made more sense than Northern had anticipated. It wasn't an act of heroism. It was an act of preservation. That is, if the theory was true. And even if it wasn't, Northern didn't blame the philosopher who first posited it. Instead, he was amazed. In the grand scheme of things, unawakened souls were more valuable than an awakened one, because they were the fuel for another to awaken. If 10 awakened souls were snuffed out, it meant a drifter had been prevented from ever being born. If no one cared for the existence of mundane humans, if they continued treating them as insignificant insects, then at some point they would cease to exist. Drifters would awaken less. Humanity would fall. And whatever remained would be a dying race, void of drifters, or at best, a world with only 1 or 2 left. So that's why Northern could come to terms with such an act of responsibility and preservation. He nodded, having nothing more to say. I guess it does make some sense when looked at that way. If the theory is true, that is. Paragon Reisel shrugged. Whether it's true or not, I've chosen it as my way of life. It keeps me sane, so it changes nothing. Northern regarded the Paragon for a moment but didn't respond. Nothing needed to be said anymore. Then, clap. Paragon Reisel smacked his hands together, the loud sound tearing through the room, breaking its heavy tension. So, anyone with divine ideas? Northern lingered for a second. Then he spoke. I have a way. Chapter 842. Wrath of a Paragon. Paragon Reisel observed Northern with intrigue, arms folded, a pleasant smile playing on his lips. Of course you do, you brat. His smile widened, blooming like heavenly jade flowers, an inexplicably ethereal sight. Northern, unfazed by the strange beauty in the man's expression, exhaled slowly before speaking. There's something about my ability. It's like a world of abilities, one that can accommodate other abilities. His gaze swept over the gathered figures, measuring their reactions before continuing. But the best part is, it's not just a world that can accommodate abilities. It can accommodate humans too. Silence followed. Paragon Reisel remained still, contemplating Northern's words before finally speaking. I assume that's where Sir Elitis and Sir Byran just emerged from? Northern nodded. Yes. He paused, then continued. I can harbor or create a channel for as many souls as possible and to pass through. However, there are limits to the kind of souls I can accommodate. Oh? It'd be rather strange if there weren't any. Please go on. Northern shot the Paragon a skeptical glance before resuming his explanation. As you already know, A sage, an ascendant, and a paragon possess dangerously powerful souls. My soul would perceive yours as a threat, and there's no telling what could happen. That wasn't entirely true. In fact, Northern knew exactly what would happen if a paragon's soul entered the limitless void. The vast, primordial void nested within him would react sharply. It would either attempt to infect Paragon Rizel, or shred his soul apart and absorb it. Northern didn't know how he understood this, but the awareness sat in him like an undeniable truth, woven through the synchronicity between himself and the void. Just like how he had accessed the void's memory to glean the knowledge of creation. His version, though miniature in comparison, still held weight. The instinctive nudge at the back of Northern's mind whispered that having a paragon within the embrace of his soul was far more dangerous than he was letting on. It wasn't just a risk. It was devastation waiting to unfold. But he chose to let it seem casual. Framing it as a mere limitation was safer that way. Paragon Rizel nodded thoughtfully, digesting Northern's words. That means all the sages, ascendants, and paragons would have to travel separately? Northern nodded his head slightly. The paragon seemed lost in thought, his gaze distant and calculating. Then, after a moment, his focus sharpened, locking back onto Northern. I have a question, Ral. Northern hesitated for a beat before responding. Okay. Rizel studied him with renewed interest. Please, enlighten me on how exactly people will use your soul as a channel. Northern's fingers moved subtly as he gestured, explaining. Right now, I have a clone in Verilania. I can use it to open a portal there. Everyone would pass through the limitless void to Verilania. The paragon frowned a little bit and inquired, staring straightly at Northern. Why Verilania? Because that is where my clone is? And it's the closest nation from here. Unless, of course, you don't want to go to Verilania. Rizel's expression darkened. A long silence stretched between them before he exhaled, rubbing his temple. Ral, of all places we could escape to, Verilania is the worst choice. Northern frowned slightly, intrigued by the sudden weight in the paragon's tone. Why? Rizel leaned away from the table, pacing forward in slow, deliberate strides. Verilania is an open city. More importantly, as you've said, it's the closest city to this blockade. Anyone with a working brain would assume that if we somehow, by some miracle, escaped this blockade or tore through it, our destination would be Verilania. It's what any sane person would do. He paused, raising a single finger. But there's a flaw in that assumption. Northern listened intently. Since we won't be traveling by the monster-congested roads, they won't see us coming. There will be no information leak, no warning until we arrive in Verilania. Whatever trap they've set for us there will still activate, just not as immediately or as efficiently as it would have if we had come by road. Northern nodded slowly. So what's the problem then? If we have that advantage, why not choose Verilania? Rizel shook his head. It's too easy, too predictable. We can use your ability in a way that no one expects, throw our enemies completely off their game. His voice dropped slightly, his tone edged with something colder, more calculating. And most importantly, I need time to act. I don't know what Dante is up to right now, but I have to find out. Northern glanced at Elitis. I don't think you need to stress yourself about finding out. Paragon Rizel's gaze shifted toward the prim and proper man standing near the corner of the room. Elitis remained composed, while Byran, standing a few meters away, observed with cold detachment. If someone were to judge the Sword King solely by his appearance, they'd never guess he was such a jovial and lively man. Summon. Rizel shook his head with a soft chuckle. Come now. There's a limit to the amount of information even someone like Elitis can access. His voice lowered, serious but knowing. So, I'm not saying Elitis lacks information. I'm saying there's a high chance that what he knows has already been manipulated. Quiet pause. Then I suppose. The shopkeeper's voice cut in smoothly. The leader of this revolution has already manipulated the entire continent into believing he's purging the government from within, with the flames of his blade. Paragon Rizel froze. A grimace crossed his face. Dark, heavy, and furious. Northern had never seen the Paragon this pissed since arriving here. What did you just say? Reisel's voice was dangerously low. The shopkeeper met his gaze evenly. Lieutenant Dante has an army of ascendants and sages, ones who will soon become paragons and ascendants themselves. I believe he's buying time to allow this growth, all while purging the government in the meantime. His eyes narrowed slightly. And he locked you in this place to keep you out of his business. The temperature in the room shifted violently. A ghastly green flame erupted in Reisel's eyes. A crushing, oppressive force exploded outward. The air itself thickened, solidifying, pressing against their lungs. Every breath was a struggle. The walls groaned, as if buckling under invisible weight. Northern felt it immediately. His pulse slammed against his ribs, his heart hammering faster than it should. It wasn't fear. It was an acknowledgement. No matter how powerful he had grown, the wrath of a paragon was a force of nature. Sage Mac and Ascendant Zion were in far worse condition. Their faces had gone pale, sweat trickling down their temples. Their bodies trembled under the sheer weight of Reisel's fury. If no one intervened soon, they might pass out or worse. Perhaps even Lithia itself would suffer under the oppressive force Reisel was emanating. Northern was about to step in. But before he could, Byran moved past him. The Sword King walked up to the seething paragon and, with effortless ease, placed a hand on his shoulder. His voice was calm, even. Hey, hey! Byron's lips curved into something dangerously close to amusement. Calm your hot balls. My master is here. Chapter 843. Escape Plan. Paragon Reisel turned his head, his gaze settling on the white-haired man standing beside him. For a brief moment, his eyes flickered with something foreign, unrecognition, as if the world itself had momentarily slipped from his grasp. But within that brief lapse, in the depths of his gaze, a ferocious flame blazed, a consuming wrath, smoldering with unchecked might. Yet, under that furious heat, Byran remained impassive, unaffected. He neither flinched nor wavered, daring to stand within reach of the paragon. Worse, he even touched him. The atmosphere burned with Reisel's rage, an oppressive storm threatening to explode. But then he smiled. The next instant, the oppressive weight vanished as if it had never existed. Northern and the others stood frozen, disbelief flickering in their eyes. No one had ever seen Paragon Reisel's face twisted in anger before. He had always been a chill, charismatic presence, his easygoing nature making it dangerously effortless to forget what his level of existence entailed. Today they had been reminded. Reisel swept his gaze across the gathering, his eyes lingering on Ascendant Zion, Sage Mac, and Elitis, each in a pitiful state. Then, his voice, smooth yet weighted, cut through the silence. Guys, I sincerely apologize. I lost myself for a moment there. Ascendant Zion, still panting, rubbed his throat before forcing out a sharp exhale. It's fine, sir. It's not like it's your fault we were weak. His gaze flickered toward Northern, the only one left standing completely unaffected. At the same moment, Reisel spoke again. You keep amazing me, Ral. To think you could withstand that pressure so easily. Do you know what that was? Northern's gaze lingered on the paragon for a fraction longer before he responded. I wouldn't say easily. I felt it as much as everyone else. Maybe I just had better endurance. Reisel scoffed. You should give yourself more credit. You just easily survived a facet of essence manifestation. Then his gaze shifted, landing on Byran. His expression grew obstinate, his eyes trailing to the Sword King's hand still resting on his shoulder. You can take it off now, thank you. A crooked grin flitted across Byron's lips before vanishing just as quickly. He withdrew his hand, stepping back until he stood behind Northern. Essence.
Manifestation. No wonder.
Northern had been in the presence of anger before, different kinds of it. Rage, fury, indignation, wrath. Yet none had ever pressed into his soul the way Paragon Rizel's just had. A paragon truly was a magnificent existence. He couldn't wait to reach that stage. I wonder what kind of things a luminary would be capable of. Sighing inwardly, he brought his focus back to the room, stating evenly, I didn't know your ties with the inner chambers of the government were so deep. It suddenly makes sense why Dante would go through all that effort to cage you here. For a few moments, Paragon Rizel was silent, his expression unreadable. Then, after what felt like an eternity, he let out a small smile, gloomy, almost embarrassed. My, wife, is there? Northern's eyes widened, then widened again. Your wife is a government official? The entire room fell silent. Everyone was just as stunned, their expressions mirroring Northern's disbelief. Oh wow, I never thought you had a wife, Sage Mac blurted out. You look more like the type that has a lot of mistresses instead. Ascendant Zion grinned hard, looking oddly pleased, shocked, amazed, but also strangely entertained. Rizel exhaled sharply. Will you two shut those loose things you call mouths? Yes. Sure, boss. The paragon rubbed his temple, fingers threading through crimson hair with a flicker of frustration. He didn't like being vulnerable. Northern could tell. It was an odd feeling to see him this way, like witnessing a mountain tremble for the first time. But strangely, within the next breath, he was composed again. His gaze steadied, his voice quiet but firm. Ivory is all I have left. She's the reason I haven't become a lost cause. I've had plenty of opportunities to go astray. The world has betrayed me multiple times. The government, too. But she has this way of keeping me sane. Keeping me whole. His voice trailed. Plus. The weight of his hesitation settled over the room like a thundercloud, thick and heavy. She's pregnant. The air turned cold. For a split second, Northern felt the rage. The same wrath Rizel had displayed earlier, surging like a slow-burning inferno. Ah, crap. Dante, son of a goat. One glance around the room confirmed it. Everyone else probably felt the same. The mood had turned grave, suffocating. Then, amidst the silence, Ascendant Zion beamed. His smile was warm, his voice light yet unwavering, cutting through the tension like a knife through mist. Don't worry, sir. I'm sure your wife and her unborn child will be perfectly fine. And we will save them, right? He turned toward Northern, waiting for confirmation. Northern met his gaze. Right? We'll save them. Rizel let out a breath, a small, almost self-deprecating smile on his lips. I'm slightly embarrassed. I should be the one assuring you guys. Northern shrugged. It's all right. Even a paragon could use help too. His voice turned sharper, more focused. So, what location do you think we should head to instead of Variolania? Paragon Rizel's expression turned stern. Fugal. Northern's face darkened. Fugal? Fugal is far. Rizel nodded. Fugal is where the HQ is. If there's anywhere Dante is currently in, or will end up in, it's Fugal. Northern narrowed his eyes. Will end up in? My assumption is that he's moving systematically, hunting government officials one by one. Fugal is the most fortified stronghold of the government, the hardest to breach. And my wife is there. The Dante I know would save the best for last. His voice cooled, his expression hardening further. It's also the only place where people can be safe, so long as we eliminate the imminent threat. He folded his arms and began pacing. We don't know what Dante has prepared in Variolania in case I escaped. And he knows I wouldn't escape alone, which means he's prepared something big. Something overwhelming. But Fugal. At least there, we know what we're up against. Silence settled over the room. Everyone absorbed his words, weighing the risks. Then, Elitis broke the quiet. If that's the case, I think the drifters should travel separately. Rizel's gaze shifted toward him. Elitis continued, voice steady. As my liege has said, Fugal is far. If we all move together, our presence will be exposed long before we arrive. Speed is the key to reaching Fugal in time, but unfortunately not everyone here has it. Instead, we should use the drifters to create a diversion, while those with overwhelming speed make a direct move toward Fugal. That means you and my liege. Sage Mac frowned slightly. How are we supposed to cross the blockade without the Paragon? Northern exhaled, his voice calm but resolute. I'll send my people with you. There'll be enough to carve a path through the blockade. All you need to do is support them. Paragon Rizel and I will fly straight to Fugal. That's the fastest way. Rizel considered his words, his gaze unreadable. After a few seconds, he spoke again. Just out of curiosity, when you say your people, who exactly do you mean? Northern hesitated. Then his gaze met Rizel's. I guess it's better to show you. The air in the room turned cold. Chapter 844. Final Verdict. The air in the room turned frigid, sending chills crawling over the skin of everyone present. Paragon Rizel's brows twitched, a faint crease forming as he absorbed the sensation. It was eerily similar to what he had felt moments ago, right before Byran stepped out. But unlike then, this presence was not as imposing. No, it was something far more sinister. He remained still, waiting in dark anticipation. Behind Northern, dark flames pooled and began to rise, writhing like living shadows. They twisted and swirled, birthing figures from the void flames. Seconds crawled by, stretching unnaturally long, and then they appeared. Several figures stood behind Northern, their presence looming, their forms coalescing from the darkish purple fire. A deathly silence swallowed the room. Their breaths trembled, their eyes widened, and an unspoken terror slithered into their hearts. Each of them saw different things. Not just creatures but entities. Anomalies that defied sense, almost as if existence itself bending to their shape. And then, absurdly, among them stood a goat. It was unmistakably a goat. None of them knew what a goat was. To them, it was an aberration. A sick joke standing in eerie contrast to the other quiddities surrounding Northern. How is this even possible? Ascendant Zion's innocent face had gone deathly pale, his disbelief warping into sheer horror. Sage Mac was scarcely better. His face had turned white, yet he remained silent, painstakingly absorbing what lay before him. His shoulders trembled, quaking intermittently as he struggled to muster enough endurance to withstand the crushing weight these strange beings exerted on the air itself. Northern stood motionless for a moment, then spoke. Of course, I won't send all of them with you. I'll pick the ones that will be most helpful. His words were met with absolute silence. Not the silence of apathy, but of complete, paralyzing dread. They weren't ignoring what he said. They were simply too consumed by the sheer, appalling reality of what he had wrought. And worse, he spoke as if it were nothing. Paragon Rizel, who had maintained a deadpan expression up until now, simply stared, and blinked, then stared, then blinked again, and again, several times over, until Northern's voice finally broke the suffocating tension. Rizel inhaled deeply, sighing as he ran a hand over his face, washing away the numb disbelief. Then, without a word, he stepped back to his seat. From within his robe, he pulled out a pipe and a strange sparker. He flicked it once, a faint crackle igniting at its tip. He was about to light the pot of his pipe when his hands stilled. His eyes turned distant. For a fleeting moment, something emotional flickered in his gaze. Then, with an exhale, he put the pipe and sparker away. I don't want her to nag again. He let out a slow breath, shifting his focus back to Northern. His eyes, previously dull and drained, now held a faint glimmer of life. A small smile appeared on his lips, kind and charismatic. His red hair swayed in the soft, unnatural wind that whispered through the room. And for the first time since Northern unleashed the abyss, the room felt like it was breathing again. Forgive me for asking, Ral. I thought you could create clones? What exactly are these things? Northern exhaled, his gaze unreadable. With a simple gesture, the void flames surged, swallowing the summoned entities whole before vanishing into nothingness. Then he spoke. It's difficult to explain, really, but let's say, they are vessels, manifestations of the souls of monsters I've killed, made possible by an enigmatic presence that resides within my soul. Of course, having a clone talent has played a crucial role in shaping them. Paragon Rizel grinned in disbelief. To be honest, I don't fully understand a damn thing you just said. But I have a general idea, and I'm not about to poke any further. However, he let out a chuckle, shaking his head. I am so glad that someone as horrific and resourceful as you is not my enemy. Northern remained impassive, considering the words before offering a measured response. There's no telling what will happen. The Paragon's chuckle turned into a full laugh. Talk about a sadistic human. What? You planning to make an enemy out of me and turn your life into a living hell? Northern frowned, confused. Didn't you just say you were glad I wasn't your enemy? Rizel's smirk widened. I don't understand why that implies I won't crush your miserable soul if you dare. Northern went silent, swallowing his words. Paragons are damn cocky. He'd love to knock one off their high horse sometime, preferably before he became a paragon himself. Meanwhile, Rizel stood and turned toward the window, leaning against it as he gazed over the battered city. His crimson hair caught in the subtle wind, his expression distant, somber. After a long pause, he turned back, his voice regaining its usual commanding weight. What we will be doing now is this. His sharp gaze settled on Ascendant Zion and Sage Mac. The two of you will be leading every drifter, from Masters upward to Variolania. During that journey, I expect you to prioritize safety, no rash decisions. As you've seen, Ral here will be sending some help along the way. He smirked, nodding assertively before adding, and make sure you don't die. Or if you do die, I'll drag your souls back and kill you myself. Ascendant Zion beat his chest with a fierce grin. I have survived this long, sir. Death wouldn't dare. Better. At that moment, Elitis stepped forward and bowed toward Northern. My liege, if possible, I would like to travel to Variolania with them. There's a task I need to complete there. Northern had no reason to refuse him, especially now, after realizing how valuable the shopkeeper was to human society. He suddenly felt reluctant to accept Elitis' obeisance. It's fine. Paragon Rizel glanced at Northern, a knowing smile tugging at the corners of his lips. Ral and I will be heading over to Fugal.
Chapter 845. Roma.
After Paragon Rizel outlined the execution of tasks, he spoke briefly about the voyage to Variolania. In that regard, Northern contributed the most. He was the one who had crossed the forests and mountains alone, making it safely to Lithia. So, he had plenty to share with Ascendant Zion and Sage Mac. With careful precision, Northern explained what he had encountered, what they needed to be cautious of, and what they should look out for. At the same time, he reassured them that none of the threats they might face were beyond his summon's ability to handle. They were in safe hands. Once the briefing ended, Northern had somewhere to be. Towards the end of the meeting, Howe had arrived, seeking him out, but he hadn't been allowed entry. Northern had a good idea why could have had to see him. So, as soon as the gathering concluded, he left. As he walked down the hall, he spotted Howe and slowed his pace for the old man to catch up. Northern glanced at him. Is she awake? Yes. She woke up recently, looking quite lost. And I must admit, you did pick a good one. She's sparkling and radiant like a star. Northern paused for a moment, his brow furrowing in mild confusion before he continued forward. For the rest of the walk, he remained silent, his mind elsewhere. Finally, they reached Braham's infirmary. The healer stepped forward, clad in flamboyant armor streaked with veins of molten lava, glowing like fissures in darkened stone. Braham waved a hand toward Howe, resting it on his shoulder with an easy, pleasant smile. Despite the healer's undeniable handsomeness, Northern still found him utterly disgusting and rude. However, Howe had long since learned to tolerate his rudeness. Not out of patience, but out of necessity, Braham had what he wanted. And until he got it, he would have to endure whatever bad things came his way. That was the unfair law of business. a principle how had been taught early. Sometimes you had to bow your head to get what you wanted. And as far as nature was concerned, that law applied to anybody, anytime. Today, it was Howe's turn to be humble and tolerant. Tomorrow, it could just as easily be Graham's. The tables always turned. In the merchant world, nothing was a permanent certainty. Of course, there were exceptions, people who didn't just play the game but controlled it. Graham was nowhere near that level. And as for Howe, he was carving his path toward becoming one of them. Or rather, to be precise, he was making Northern one of them. Graham shifted his gaze to Northern. My good client. He paused, squinting slightly. Did I ever get your name? I am Rian. Graham raised his brows in realization. Oh, Rian. That's a convenient name. Are you, by chance, related to the extended royalty of Riamgard? He chuckled at his own joke before adding, of course you couldn't possibly be. How would a plebeian like you come from the lineage of those closer to the luminance star than any other human race on trial? Northern stared at him impassively. I bet he'd be shocked out of his damn mind. Of course, he wasn't about to throw around sensitive truths just to slap Graham in the face. He knew better than to be so petty. That didn't mean, however, that if fate ever arranged such a moment, he wouldn't take full advantage of it. Northern looked at the healer and asked, Can I see her? Graham grinned. Of course you can. I assured you, she'll be as good as new, and she truly is. She's not here, though. Northern raised a brow. Then where is she? Graham turned toward another part of the hallway. Follow me. She should be on one of the balconies. Northern walked after him, his gaze briefly resting on the molten vein. No spirit linen, from behind. The summon looked utterly sick of Graham's presence, practically radiating relief at seeing its master nearby. Through their link, Northern was already receiving everything his summon had observed, including all that Graham had been doing. He could have accessed this information without physically seeing the spirit linen, but he'd been preoccupied. Now, walking alongside Graham seemed like the perfect time to catch up. Until Graham's grating voice interrupted his thoughts. By the way, Rian, I was going to ask. This young lady, who is she to you? Graham glanced at Northern, his ever-present smile perfectly composed. A mask. Northern remained silent for a moment, considering the question. Roma had been a persistent source of annoyance since the day they met. But despite that, he couldn't ignore her resolve. It was something he actually admired. He just felt she was too naive. Life wasn't sweet, and it certainly didn't deserve sweet people like her. Yet, despite how annoying she could be, she never seemed to grasp that reality. That aside, she was a good friend. At the end of the day, everyone was annoying in their own way. Northern was sure he was to some people too. And when he compared the kind of people who had been tossing the word friend around him lately, Roma was far better. A true friend in her own way. That didn't mean he trusted her or relied on her. He was aware she was hiding things, particularly about her origins. But Northern didn't care. He was in the same boat, possibly even worse. She's a friend. Graham's eyes widened slightly. Strangely enough, he looked relieved. Northern didn't understand why. The next moment, however, Graham's voice broke the silence. Lower this time, almost emotional. You know, Rian, I'm a weird guy. Most people don't understand me, and honestly, I don't care. I don't even feel drawn to anyone, not usually. The number of times I've ever truly valued someone is rare. It's happened only once in my life. Back in the Dark Continent. He hesitated, as if caught in thought, then continued, Ah, right. Have you heard of the Dark Continent? I came from there. How to? Actually, now that I think about it, you seem quite familiar with how. Could you be from the Dark Continent as well? Northern stopped in his tracks and gave him a long, unreadable stare. Then, instead of answering, he glanced around the hall and frowned slightly. Where exactly is the balcony? Graham sighed. Not much of a talker, I see. Follow me. It's just around the corner. They turned into another hallway, and there she was, leaning against the terrace railing, staring down into the city below. The afternoon sun bathed her in golden warmth. her skin gleaming like polished glass touched by divinity. Her long blonde hair cascaded softly, the wind weaving through it like unseen fingers. Even clad in sleek armor, her figure was accentuated effortlessly, slender yet shaped with the elegance of an hourglass. She wasn't overly voluptuous, but her presence carried a quiet, undeniable allure. By the entrance, Braham came to a halt. He gulped. His green eyes shimmered with a raw, desperate, and passionate hunger. Chapter 846. Compassion or Pragmatism. Northern stepped through the entrance, his gait unhurried as he joined her. The moment his footsteps reached her ears, she turned. Seeing him, she moved without thinking, instinct taking over as she threw her arms around his shoulders. Rian. Oh, thank the stars. I've been so worried about you. Northern frowned slightly, disentangling himself from her hold. You. He started, voice edged with something sharp, but then exhaled, reining it in. His tone evened out. Who should be worried about who? You're in no position to be worrying about me.
Roma chuckled lightly. I'm sorry.
I've been awake for a while, and Lady Rita told me things here were far worse than what we went through coming here. She also mentioned that you've been really helpful. Northern tilted his head, arms folding. Lady Rita? Oh, that's right, you don't know her name. The spearwoman who defended us at the bridge before you arrived. He nodded. Oh, I see. He didn't fully remember, but there was no point dragging it. People really go around naming themselves with that special letter, huh? The Riemgard Empire couldn't possibly hunt down every person who bore the letter. It wasn't a crime, not unless the bearer held status. A commoner carrying it meant nothing. But if it was a king, or a renowned duke, that was a different matter. That was the exact path Northern was on. He wasn't hiding the name, he was throwing it out there. Right now it meant little. But would that be the same when he became a paragon? Only one way to find out. Become a paragon. Northern sighed and shifted his focus to the resplendent woman before him. She was looking up slightly, her gaze scanning his face. Have you been eating at all? You look starved. He frowned again. You're seriously a pain in my ass. Why are you like this? Roma scowled. Hey, that's not something nice to say to someone who just recovered. Well, then maybe that someone should remember that the one who just recovered should be the one being asked questions. She shrugged. And since you didn't ask? I was worried about you. And not just you, I checked on everyone. Oh, and the baby's doing great, by the way. His mother even said she's naming him after both of us. Bonus information, since you don't care. Northern shook his head. It's not that I don't. I've just been busy with other, more important things. Of course you have. That's why I'm giving it to you as a bonus. Northern fell silent, staring at her, his anger simmering. In the past few days, nothing had truly gotten under his skin. But somehow, in the last few seconds, she had managed it effortlessly. What hole did this excuse for an existence crawl out of exactly? Northern inhaled deeply, then exhaled. Patience, patience. He looked at her, his gaze steady, his tangled emotions smoothing out. When he spoke, his voice was calm. How do you feel? Roma studied his face for a moment before leaning against the railing, her eyes drifting downward, shadowed by something somber. Strangely, I feel fine. Lady Rita told me how you saved me. I'm grateful. And sorry. Northern's lips curled slightly. That's not going to be enough, though. Her expression sharpened into a frown. What? What do you mean? Your recklessness knows no bounds. At the very least, I thought you had some semblance of sense. Turns out I was wrong. His voice was even, but the weight behind it pressed down like an iron hand. What did you think? That you could protect anyone? That you could survive with how weak you are? Roma's delicate frown twisted into a fierce, almost vicious grimace. Yet even with anger lighting her features, she remained ethereal, a celestial sight. You really don't have to shove it in my face every time I'm weak, Rian. Her voice trembled with frustration. I know I'm weak. I know I'm so weak that it drives me crazy. And it drives me crazy. So no, You don't get to be so cruel as to shove it in my face every chance you get. Her outburst sent a ripple through the air. Nearby, Howe instinctively took a step back, yanking Graham with him, though the latter resisted, unable to tear his fascinated gaze away. Roma, oblivious to them, pressed on, her voice rising. Does it really matter? It doesn't. Rian. It's a new life. Someone had to do something. Anything would have helped, no matter how small or insignificant. And I did. I bought everyone a second or two, and I was glad to do it. If I had died, Rian, her breath cracked, but she pushed through. I wouldn't have had any regrets. So save me some space with all you're weak this, you can't protect anyone that. You don't get to lecture me just because you're strong. The words hung between them, electric, raw. The ability to protect doesn't start with power, it starts with the heart. Roma's voice cut through the air, sharp yet trembling. You could have all the power in the world and still be hollow, empty, unempathetic. You would watch everyone die before your eyes, because to you, defeating the enemy is more important than saving the one civilian about to be crushed under the weight of its attack. Because they're insignificant, and the enemy is more important. Her voice dipped lower, tangled in something bitter, something wounded. But you know, Rian, what if you're so busy taking care of this more important thing, so obsessed with winning, that by the time you defeat it, there's no world left to return to? Her breath shook. Then her voice cracked, raw with frustration. When exactly will you stop fighting just to feel good about yourself? Just to feel powerful? Just for confirmation? When will you start fighting to preserve? To protect? When exactly will you grow up? Northern stood in silence, frowning. Her words had cut deep, bitter and hard to swallow. Is this what people mean when they say the truth is bitter? Did that mean what she was saying was the truth? He refused to accept that. He wasn't fighting to feel good. He was fighting because it was the only way forward. He wasn't looking for some hollow confirmation of his strength. He knew he was strong. And more than that, he had no interest in proving anything to anyone. So she was wrong. His frown darkened, his gaze sharpening with something colder. How many days have you actually known me? Roma frowned at the abrupt question. What? I don't need to. It hasn't even been a damn week. His voice rang out, contempt laced into every syllable. Some of what she said was bitter truth. He could admit that. Learning the importance of every insignificant life, maybe he did need to understand that more. But everything else? The accusations? The audacity? She had no idea what she was talking about. He stepped forward, lowering his head slightly, his voice razor-edged. I don't know what gives you the confidence to open your rotten mouth and talk to me however you want, to berate me, to act as if I'm the most selfish person to ever exist. His gaze bored into hers, radiating rigid, unshaken coldness. Look here, Roma. You are far more selfish than I am. All that running around, saving people, it's nothing but self-conceit. A desperate excuse to convince yourself that your weakness doesn't matter. A pathetic justification for your own insignificance. In the grand scheme of things, your boldness, your courage. He spat the words, scorn dripping from them. Will be the end of you. It's reckless. It's pointless. And in the end, he leaned in, voice dropping to something chilling. No one will even remember it. Roma's face twisted, but Northern didn't let her speak. All that talk about passion? It was never about protecting people. It was about you, your twisted definition of strength. Your need to feel good about yourself. To delude yourself into thinking you matter. He stepped back, his frown deepening. I need to grow up? Sure. Thanks for the advice. His voice was razor-sharp now, slicing through the air with brutal finality. But you need to accept reality. You are not a drifter, and you never will be. So take a back seat and act like every other mundane, useless human like you should. Northern held her gaze for a beat longer, his fury simmering. Then, without another word, he turned and walked away, leaving her standing there. Frozen, silent, and alone. Chapter 847. A Figure of Resilience. Northern exhaled heavily as he stepped onto the balcony. The tension inside had weighed on him like an anvil, and now, with each breath, it felt as if some of that weight had been lifted, though not entirely. Regret crept in almost immediately. The words he'd spoken echoed in his mind, leaving a bitter taste behind. The next moment his steps faltered, and he frowned. "What are you doing?" Byron stood beside him, arms folded, a dark expression settling over his features. "What?" Northern asked, noticing something unusual. The Sword King carried an aura he didn't usually have. Byron had always been capable of coming across as cold and detached, his sharp features only reinforcing that impression. But with Northern, he had always been different, more direct and never unfeeling. This time, however, something was different. "Did you really have to go that far?" Byron's voice was quiet, but firm. "I get what you were trying to do. You wanted to break her, to make her understand that her recklessness won't keep her alive. You hoped that if she learned to restrain herself, she wouldn't keep throwing herself into danger." He sighed, shaking his head. "But are you sure you didn't take it too far?" His gaze settled on Northern, unreadable. "She's young, and at the end of the day, she's just a girl who wants the freedom to do as she pleases, just like you do. Beating her down so harshly just because she lacked the power to protect herself, that isn't fair." Northern clenched his jaw, suppressing a frown. "I know." His voice was quieter now. "I know, Byron." Even he couldn't fully understand why he had lashed out like that. He had wanted to destroy her courage, to crush that reckless bravery, believing that if she feared the consequences, she'd finally obey him, that she'd stop throwing herself into danger. His hands curled into fists. "But damn it!" His voice wavered. "I really need to grow up." Inside, he was a mess. A tangled, twisted knot of emotions he couldn't even begin to untangle. "Do I need a therapist?" Maybe he had been right after all. Byron sighed. "Tactically, you made the right call. You did it for her good. But morally, you were wrong." His gaze was steady. "Because in the end, you did the very thing you accused her of. You beat her down because you wanted her to be safe. Just like she threw herself into danger because she wanted to matter. Selfishness on both sides." He paused, watching Northern's expression carefully before continuing. "At the end of it all, selfishness is a part of being human. Just don't be a hypocrite about it." His tone darkened. "You've been rather hypocritical, Master. You call out others for their selfishness while doing the same, just in a different form. It doesn't have to be an exact mirror, but take a step back. Look at every single thing you resent in people, then look at yourself. How you've treated them. How you've treated yourself." Northern remained silent, his fingers curling slightly. Byron exhaled. "You need to be able to inspect yourself at all times, Master. Ask yourself the questions that force you to grow. Make sure you're getting better. Make sure you're not lying to yourself." Byron scratched the back of his neck, muttering. More so her intentions, flawed as the execution was, were noble. He gave Northern one last assessing look. Then, without another word, he disappeared. Northern stood there, turning the words over in his mind. He was both amused and uneasy at the Sword King's insight. As he found himself questioning everything, a single thought surfaced through the noise. Maybe I should apologize to her. As that thought formed, he heard approaching footsteps. He turned, eyes widening in surprise. It was Roma. What is she? Contrary to what anyone might expect, she wasn't beaten down. She wasn't broken. She was burning. Indignation blazed in her eyes as she stormed toward him, each step like the march of a soldier ready for war. Northern felt his throat go dry. He swallowed hard. When she stopped in front of him, she inhaled deeply, then let the breath out in one slow, controlled exhale. Her expression straightened. Her eyes met his with a chilling calmness. Something shifted in the air around her, subtle but unmistakable. At first, Northern had assumed she was retaliating because his words had cut her too deep, that she was lashing out in anger, wounded by what he had said. But now he wasn't sure. He was certain it must have hurt. And yet, this wasn't mere retaliation. Roma stared at him for a long, blank moment. Then, her voice cut through the silence like a blade. For such a wise man, he speaks so much nonsense that he does not understand. Northern frowned slightly. What? Roma didn't stop. She didn't even hesitate. You think my weakness makes me useless? Maybe. But tell me, Rian, do you even know what you're fighting for? Or do you just fight because you're afraid of stopping long enough to find out? Northern's breath caught. You're right, she continued, her tone unwavering. I'm weak. I'd probably die if I tried again. But strength isn't something you hand down like a lesson in a lecture. It's something people find in themselves. You think my bravery is selfish? Maybe. But you're a fool if you think I'm doing this for me. The air between them felt electric. You don't have to believe in me, Rian. Her voice dropped, final and unyielding. But you damn well better remember me when the day comes that I prove you wrong. Roma took a step closer. Then, unexpectedly, she hugged him. Northern stiffened, caught him completely off guard, making him feel strange. You are an amazing person, she murmured, her voice steady. And I know it. He didn't move. You're a good friend too, she continued. Even though we disagree on several fronts, that doesn't change anything. So, sincerely thank you for everything you did on our way to Lithia. Then, just as suddenly, she pulled away, a small smile gracing her lips. After I do what I came here to do, I'll be leaving. She exhaled lightly. Don't ask me how. My brother and family will probably find me soon. By now, they've likely noticed I've run away. Her gaze softened, yet there was resolve behind it. I do hope we meet again someday. She tilted her head slightly. Both of us as better people than we are now. Northern held her gaze for a moment, then nodded. I hope so too. Chapter 848 Reflection. Northern watched Roma disappear from view, the embers of her final words still smoldering in his mind. He turned away, retreating to the balcony where the city stretched beneath him, lost in thoughts to the flow of time and unaware of when the dim lights of the city had come alive, flickering like dying stars in the cold night air. He had been in deep thoughts over the last few hours about the things that had transpired then. Byron's words, Roma's defiance, his own voice, sharp with contempt, now ringing hollow. For all his strength, all his certainty, he felt unsteady. You've been rather hypocritical, master. Byron had struck at something Northern hadn't been ready to face. Had he really been so blind to his own contradictions? He had called Roma selfish for throwing herself into danger, yet had he not done the same, again and again? And it wasn't just about now. It never was. From the Dark Continent, to his resentment toward Raven, his so-called unwillingness to be used. But had he not done the same? Had he not intended to use them all just to return home? The misfortunes had simply stacked atop his head, whether by fate or by Terrence's interference. He couldn't be sure. She was a saintess, after all. Maybe speaking to Raven, truly speaking to her, would give him a clearer answer. Or perhaps before that, he needed to understand her. Maybe he needed to stop centering himself in everything, stop justifying his hypocrisy with cold logic. Maybe, just maybe, he needed to start seeing the struggles of others, not as obstacles but as something worth understanding. Empathy. Not to the extent that it shattered his principles. But he had a vast soul, didn't he? He could make room for more. Room for flexibility. And more importantly, he needed to acknowledge those who walked a path similar to his own, even if their approach was different. No, not necessarily acknowledge them. If they were weak and powerless, they were still of no consequence. But he didn't need to criticize them for it either. Had he not also fought reckless battles? Had he not survived by being brave and foolish, facing death when there was no hope of survival? Northern gritted his teeth. There was a difference. What made his sacrifices different from Roma's? Power. That was the answer, wasn't it? He had power. He had the ability to ensure that his battles weren't in vain. But did that truly change the core truth? He fought because he chose to, just as Roma had. Was survival really the only thing that mattered? He had always believed that the weak had no place on the battlefield. That courage without strength was nothing but a fool's death sentence. And yet Roma had stood before him, bloodied, unbroken. She had faced him down without fear, without hesitation. And in doing so, she had done something no opponent, no monster, no enemy had managed in a long time. She had forced him to reflect. He had spoken to break her, to strip away the illusion of heroism before it got her killed. But she hadn't shattered. She had walked away stronger. Do you even know what you're fighting for? Or do you just fight because you're afraid of stopping long enough to find out? Northern exhaled, dragging a hand down his face. The words gnawed at him, a truth he couldn't ignore. Had he ever truly fought for something? Or had he simply fought because it was all he knew? He had always assumed he had the answers, that his way was the only way, that survival and victory were all that mattered. But Roma's defiance, her absolute refusal to accept his judgment, left an unsettling realization in its wake. There was more than one kind of strength. And just because he was stronger than her now didn't mean she would always remain beneath him. He had underestimated her, not just her will but her ability to change. And if she could change, then what about him? Northern stared at his hands. Strong hands, forged in battle. Hands that had slain monstrosities and endured the deepest of hells. And yet, for all their strength, there was something deeply unsure beneath his skin. What if Byran was right? What if, in his efforts to teach others the cost of weakness, he had blinded himself to the cost of his own coldness? What if strength wasn't just about survival, but about what you chose to do with it? His grip on the railing tightened. The thought sat heavy in his chest. Uncomfortable, unwelcome, but impossible to ignore. Byran had said something else before leaving. Words that now felt like a splinter buried beneath his skin. You need to inspect yourself at all times, Master. Ask yourself the questions that force you to grow. Make sure you're not lying to yourself. Northern had never questioned himself before. But maybe it was time to start. He didn't leave that balcony with all the answers. He didn't suddenly believe in Roma's ideals, and he certainly didn't abandon his belief in strength. But for the first time, he accepted the possibility that he wasn't entirely right. And that was the first step. The next time he saw Roma, he wouldn't apologize. But he would listen, because whether he admitted it or not, she had changed something in him. Northern exhaled heavily, feeling the weight on his chest lift. He cast one last glance at the dying embers of the city before turning his attention to Paragon Rizel, whose presence he had already sensed approaching. The Paragon stepped onto the balcony, a faint smile tugging at his lips as he closed the distance. I met the girl, Rizel said, his tone light yet deliberate. And I can't say I'm surprised she's here. I made sure to thank her properly. Northern frowned slightly. You know her? Rizel hesitated for a fraction of a second, just enough to be noticed. You don't. I met her during the voyage. The Paragon studied him with an unreadable expression before shaking his head. You're quite an apathetic person, Ral. I wouldn't recommend staying that way. Northern let out a short chuckle. Can't blame me. I grew up sheltered. There are some things I know, though. Rizel waved dismissively. Doesn't matter. That girl. She's the daughter of the headmaster of the strongest citadel in the Central Plains. And also the king of a small nation called Ryugan. Northern's brow furrowed as he processed the revelation. Rizel continued. Ryugan is at odds with the Riemgard Empire, the only city bold enough to challenge their authority on a large scale. Not just with their royal name, but through their nation's name as well. Northern's eyes widened. He was genuinely surprised. I'm shocked they're still on the map. Rizel grinned. I am too. Her father and brothers are a troublesome lot. If I'm right, they're probably tearing through the blockade of monsters as we speak, coming to retrieve her. His grin faded slightly. And that means Dante and his people will be alerted. He met Northern's gaze. We might have to move things faster, Ral. Northern's expression turned serious. How fast? Rizel's smile returned, sharper this time. I'm talking about moving tonight. Chapter 849, Illusionary Haven. Tonight. Northern muttered the same word Paragon Rizel had just spoken. There was nothing wrong with moving tonight. In fact, it suited him just fine. If there was anything that gave him pause, it was what had transpired in the last hour, and the duel still raging in the Milwa contest. He had planned meticulously for that contest, yet he hadn't been able to actively participate. Though, given everything that had unfolded, this wasn't the worst outcome either. With a slight furrow of focus, he met Paragon Rizel's gaze and responded. All right, there's no problem then. Where do I start? Paragon Rizel grinned, satisfaction gleaming in his ethereal jade-green eyes. Good. I like the look on your face. He tore his gaze away from Northern, turning his attention to the city below. The sun had fully retreated behind the horizon, swallowed by the deepening shadows of the night. A strange, thicker, and more sinister darkness had settled upon the city. The hollow cries of the waves thrashing against the shore echoed through the streets, occasionally drowned out by the terrifying bellows of massive underwater abominations lurking beneath, as if waiting for the chance to tear the city itself apart. Rizel let the scene sink in for a moment, then exhaled and spoke. I've already given Zion and Mac their orders. Others are rounding up the people as we speak. Right now, what I need is for you to open that portal of yours and provide them with shelter inside your limitless void. Northern helped him with the words. Yeah, that thing. Whatever it is, it's incredibly resourceful. Paragon Rizel paused, his gaze locking onto Northern with renewed intensity, as if attempting to decipher something hidden beneath the surface. Northern, feeling the weight of that scrutiny pressing against him, shifted slightly before speaking. So, do I open it here? Right now? The Paragon remained silent for a dozen seconds, his gaze drifting into the darkness that blanketed the city. Then, recovering from his momentary contemplation, he turned back to Northern. Yes, right now. There, in the middle of the city. He pointed toward the grand fountain that marked the city's heart, standing just in front of the city hall. Northern followed the direction of Rizel's gesture and hesitated. He had never attempted what he was about to do. Never before had he opened limitless void for others to enter freely, and he would be lying if he said the idea didn't unsettle him. The thought of possible repercussions gnawed at him. Was he exposing something that shouldn't be exposed? Still, he hoped otherwise. Northern sighed. No problem then, but let me settle a few things before I open it. Rizel's eyes shimmered with amusement, his lips curling into a dashing smile. Oh please, be free. Northern gave him a final glance before vanishing into thin air. Rizel blinked, momentarily confused, though not entirely surprised. The same small, delighted smile remained frozen on his face, as he stared into the empty space where Northern had just stood. He said nothing, just watched. Meanwhile, Northern reappeared within limitless void, his gaze sweeping over the vast, endless realm. As much as he was willing to provide shelter, he wasn't about to let people freely roam his soulscape. Limitless void was nearly a realm of its own, but that didn't change one fundamental fact. It was still his soul. And the soul, no matter how fortified, remained the most vulnerable part of a being's existence. Just that, in his case, that vulnerability was buried beneath countless layers of true void. Even so, Northern wasn't about to take chances. He could place them in Void Palace. That place was reinforced, a structure designed to shield against threats, both external and internal. But the very thought made him hesitate. If anything, the idea made him even more skeptical. Because limitless void itself began at Void Palace. Void Palace was the very foundation of his soulscape, the core of everything. It wouldn't be an exaggeration to say that Void Palace was the soulscape. And that was precisely why he couldn't allow them to be there. So his first task was clear. He needed to carve out an illusionary space within limitless void. Something that mimicked Void Palace, but was nothing more than a construct, not as potent as the Void Palace. A shadow of a place. An imitation of security. Of course, it can't be as potent. It's merely an illusion of a place. How could he make this possible? Everything within limitless void bowed to Northern's will. That meant he could create a structure so real and yet so unreal, a paradox of existence bound by his imagination. There were independent constructs within limitless void, entities that existed beyond his direct influence but could still be affected by him. Void Palace was one such structure, an unshakable foundation, just like the remnants of absorbed realms. On a broad scale, none of those could be harmed. They existed as fixed realities within his domain. But anything birthed purely from his will, that was fragile. If Northern were to suffer serious injury or experience an unprecedented shock, a construct dependent on his will alone could weaken, or worse, crumble entirely. A soul attack could be even more devastating. He had no doubt that if his soul were to be struck, anything conjured from his willpower inside limitless void would fracture, perhaps cease to exist altogether. Still, the solution remained clear. He could create a realm within limitless void, a sanctuary woven from illusion. The people would mistake it for something real. But should anything happen to him in the outside world, their so-called safe haven would be the first to suffer. Northern briefly entertained the thought of caring about the risk, but he really couldn't. Of course, he was confident in his ability to protect himself. No, confident wasn't the word. He was absolutely certain. Nothing could happen to him. Northern lifted his gaze toward the crimson-stained sky above limitless void's mountains. Then, raising one hand, he traced a thin, illusionary line from the heavens down to his feet. The line pulsed, faint, wavering, then thickened, expanding as if unveiling something that had always been there. And as the fabric of space shifted, a new world was born. A world of his own imagination. A realm created in a jiffy. Chapter 850, Strange Phenomenon. What Northern decided to create was a cosmopolitan palace. A mansion adorned with luminously beautiful lights and golden designs, sitting atop a lush, verdant hill. Surrounding it were breathtaking flower gardens, their vibrant hues swaying under an endless blue sky, a sky that blanketed everything in its serene embrace. It was a plain of never-ending day, where night never fell. A perfect illusion that stood in stark contrast to the foreboding and sinister existence of the limitless void. Without a doubt, they were going to love it. He stood on the soft green grass, gazing at the enormous yet strangely lonely mansion. Don't worry, very soon you'll have thousands, if not millions, of company. Northern had already accounted for such numbers when designing the mansion. It was a vast structure, its expanse stretching endlessly across the distant green plains. And yet, even with its imposing size, it seemed almost swallowed by the sheer vastness of the land itself. He exhaled, satisfied with what he had created. Then, with a mere thought, he exited the illusionary haven, his form dissolving like mist, only to reappear on the balcony. Paragon Rizel stood there, leaning on the terrace railing, his gaze fixed upon the city below. A slightly sullen expression marred his otherwise regal features. When Northern appeared, the Paragon spared him a sidelong glance but did not move, his eyes lingering on the streets below. Northern frowned slightly as he approached the railing, mirroring Rizel's stance. He studied the older man for a moment before speaking. "Are you okay?" Paragon Rizel's response came with a handsome, almost exaggerated smile. "Oh, of course, yes. I am perfectly all right." He pushed off the railing, standing upright, stretching his back slightly before once again glancing down at the city, his ever-present little smile returning. "So, you're ready." Northern met his gaze with an unimpressed look. "I was born ready." The Paragon chuckled, his jade-green eyes glinting with amusement. "You most definitely are." Northern ignored the remark and shifted his attention to the center of the city. He exhaled slowly, a steady breath. The moment it left his lips, the temperature of the atmosphere fell. The very air seemed to shudder, a deep chill sinking into the bones of those below. Even the Paragon, who was rarely vulnerable to things like temperature, felt it, a sharp contrast to the relatively mild weather just moments before. Down in the city streets, people instinctively hugged themselves, rubbing their arms as an unnatural cold slithered through the air. It was as if winter had suddenly sharpened its fangs. The cause? Northern. More specifically, the gateway he was about to create. This was no mere rift in space. Void force made such things trivial. No, what Northern intended to summon was a fixed gateway, a semi-permanent structure that would remain at the heart of the city, standing strong until the evacuation was complete. It had to be precise. The entry point had to align perfectly with the illusionary haven. There was no room for error. But such precision came at a cost. The meticulousness required to weave the fabric of reality itself meant that Northern had to channel a drastic amount of void essence. And such ruthless manipulation of space came with an unintended consequence. It was viciously devouring the city's atmospheric temperature. A tear suddenly ripped through the sky, as if an interdimensional needle, colossal and unseen, was piercing through the fabric of reality. The rift descended, stretching downward as a pale blue light, like shimmering lightning, extended toward the earth, touched the ground. People froze in place, their eyes locked onto the unnatural phenomenon, their bodies trembling with instinctive fear. The first thought that surged through their minds, the dreadful realization, was that this looked exactly like a rift appearance. And a rift appearing in this already devastated city could only mean one thing. The date of their inevitable downfall had been shifted forward. Faces drained of color. Even drifters, those hardened by the horrors of the world, found their breaths shallow, their hands shaking. Ascendant Zion was among the group of drifters responsible for managing the evacuation to Verilania. As the others recoiled, he simply observed the tear in the sky, his expression unreadable. Then, without a word, he shifted his gaze, his sharp eyes locking onto Paragon Rizel and Northern, who stood watching from one of the balconies of the city hall. The panic among the drifters erupted. "Sir, a rift. We have to do something. How in the world? Do the stars want us dead too?" They all reacted differently, their voices rising, their dread manifesting in varying degrees of hysteria, until Zion exhaled a long, steady breath. And then he spoke. "All of you calm down. This is not a rift as you all suppose." His voice cut through the fear like a blade. "It's the people's path to salvation." The words hung in the air. A stunned silence followed. The people stared at him, expressions shifting from panic to something more volatile. Disbelief, confusion, even hostility. To them, Zion suddenly sounded like a demented heretic. A rift was tearing open right in the heart of the city, and he dared to call it a path to salvation? Zion frowned, his gaze flickering with mild irritation. "Don't look at me like that." His voice was firm. "Look at the rift instead." Their gazes turned to the center of the city, watching as the colossal rift slowly widened, its edges shimmering like a fractured mirror of reality. And then they saw something, a glimpse beyond the tear, a blurry reflection, shifting and unstable, yet undeniably vivid. Clear blue sky, verdant green land. Their eyes widened. "Captain, what is that? Am I seeing things? Or does that look like paradise? Is the rift a peaceful plain? Or are we about to get torn apart by celestial monstrosities?" "No, we are not. Shut your mouths." Ascendant Zion sighed, his patience wearing thin as he surveyed his subordinates, their expressions laced with utter confusion. He couldn't blame them. He felt it too. Even he, an Ascendant, was just as bewildered as the rest of them. Because this shouldn't be possible. How in the damned world could a drifter, like any other, possess a realm, a plane of existence? Zion had never heard of such a thing. Not once. Not ever. Chapter 851. Overpowered indeed. After opening the gate portal to the illusionary haven, as he had decided to call it, Northern found himself with an unusual amount of free time. With nothing urgent demanding his attention, he strolled through the city, even in the dark, engaging in long discussions with Hao. During their conversations, he caught up with the merchant and learned that Hao had been making steady progress in business. He had already planted Rethium in several strategic nations known for their strong forging traditions, though the venture had been far from smooth. Beyond that, Howe had begun liaising with a certain alchemist, someone he believed could harness Rethium's properties for healing potions. Healing potions were incredibly rare. The only existing ones were created through a drifter's ability, not from rift resources, making them a luxury few could afford. But if they could crack the formula, if they could successfully integrate Rethium into potion making, then they'd be set for life. More than that, it could be the key to catching the attention of the merchant monarchs. That alone was enough of an incentive for Howe. However, on the market side of things, progress was painfully slow. Forgers, artificers, and alchemists were creatures of habit, clinging to resources that had already proven their effectiveness. They rarely trusted new materials, let alone something as unfamiliar as Rethium. Many of them had flat-out refused Howe's offers. And the only way to force a shift in perspective, to make them acknowledge Rethium's worth, was through weapon crafting itself. Howe had considered hiring forgers to help with that, but Northern had his doubts. Because he understood what kind of resource Rethium truly was. It was a monstrosity, and the kind of forger capable of handling it was rare, far rarer than Howe seemed to realize. In fact, there were fewer than 5 creators in existence who weren't shackled by the mediocrity of creation. Most of them settled for less, unwilling or incapable of pushing past their own limits. Elena was one of the few exceptions. But even she might not be able to handle Rethium, which meant he had to do it himself. And that was precisely why he needed to hasten the creation of his forgery. He had shared these thoughts with Howe, and the two had discussed his plans in depth. Even though Howe had yet to break through in the resource market, he had already solidified his position as a viciously successful merchant, surpassing 10% of the trade elite. And his fortune came entirely from selling soul cores. Northern had accumulated mountains of them. The soul core market was ironclad. Drifters were desperate to saturate their cores, eager to ascend to the next rank without facing the horrors of the rifts. Of course, those kinds of drifters, the ones who sought power without struggle, were butterbread. Nothing like those tempered by the cruel, unforgiving maws of monsters. Yet, nobles these days chased rank over skill, obsessed with titles over competence. It was a disgrace, and Northern knew one day that foolishness would cost them. Perhaps, eventually, a paragon would rise, only to be so weak that he couldn't even uphold the weight of his own title. That is, if it were even possible to evolve into a paragon solely through absorbing soul cores. Which Northern highly doubted. There was something about the soul. Something that evidently changed once one became an ascendant. For now it was just a suspicion. But soon he'd know for sure. Either way, thanks to Howe's ability to stack a fortune, one way or another, there was now more than enough money to fund the near-impossible infrastructure Northern had envisioned. And most of the components that would form this edifice would be prepared and reinforced by him. Of course, with so little time on his hands, he had no intention of doing it all himself. That's what clones were for. And the best part? In the limitless void, his clones could exist independently, without drawing from his own essence reserves. Instead, they would siphon directly from the limitless pool of essence in his soulscape. In the coming days, his clones were about to become very busy. Northern smirked, realizing he'd soon be able to exist in multiple places at once. Then, a thought struck him, a deliciously terrifying one. If he became a paragon, how strong would his clones be? One paragon-level clone was already absurd. But hundreds of them? A shiver ran through him. Somebody, please stop me. I think I might be growing too strong. And the most interesting part was that his progress had been entirely secretive. Even those who knew about his abilities had no idea of their true extent. If they did, they would have already created a rule forbidding his existence. And if that failed, they would have done everything in their power to ensure he never became a paragon. Even if it meant killing him. Northern exhaled, genuinely pleased that he was a naturally secretive and cynical person. Howe, however, had been watching him closely. A strange expression crossed the merchant's face. Something between doubt and wariness. "Are ya okay?" Northern straightened his posture and exhaled. Yeah, of course. I'm perfectly fine. Suppressing the stubborn grin tugging at his lips proved more difficult than expected. Howe's gaze drifted upward. Even from this part of the city, the illusionary Haven's Gate was visible, looming over the skyline like a monument to the impossible. He stared at it for a long moment before sighing and lowering his gaze. You are a fearsome person. His voice was quiet, but firm. I fear you. Northern blinked. Then, a slow grin stretched across his face. You should say that more often. His eyes gleamed. Maybe then, I'll finally get used to swallowing it. Hal looked at him, completely speechless. He could have never expected such a self-conceited response. But Northern had recently been forcing himself to come into character. He gave Hal a thumbs up and said, I'll be retreating to my chambers now and would most likely be busy until late morning. Please inform the Paragon on my behalf, although I doubt if anyone would be able to disturb me with how persistent Jesai is. He sighed and waved Hal a goodbye before walking away. Chapter 852. Talk about ugly. Northern strolled through the dark streets of Lithia, the melancholic city silent under the weight of its own history. He was heading back to City Hall, where his room awaited him. He could have teleported or melted into the shadows, but walks like these reminded him that, despite everything, he was still human. Speaking of shadows, that talent. He had yet to test eclipsing dread. The thought of retreating into the limitless void to experiment with it crossed his mind, but he decided against it. Right now, the limitless void was teeming with activity. Even though what the people were migrating into was merely an illusion woven into its depths, it was still occupied, still restless. As he approached City Hall, a gaunt yet well-muscled man stepped forward. His gaze was calm, his brown eyes striking in the dim light. Ascendant Zion. He bowed slightly upon reaching Northern, a gesture that made Northern vaguely uncomfortable. The man looked to be in his late 20s, perhaps early 30s. If Northern were to combine the years he had lived across both worlds, he would have easily surpassed that age. Yet no matter how much he reminded himself of this, he still felt younger. It had nothing to do with appearances. Even back on Earth, he had struggled to see himself as his actual age. Growing older had always been a strange and distant concept, something he acknowledged in passing but never truly felt. Here, in this world, where responsibility and horror forged him anew with each passing moment, he was forced to grow in ways he had never experienced before. Back on Earth, everything had come too easily. His job, his wife, his life. Why have I been reminiscing about that so much lately? Northern exhaled, pushing the thought away, and smiled as Zion spoke. You mentioned providing us with some aids. I came to see you regarding that, sir. I don't know when I'll get another chance, and we need to move soon to create a diversion, considering the Ryugen brothers might be arriving any moment now. There was tension in Zion's voice, a weight behind his words that piqued Northern's curiosity. Just what kind of people are these brothers to be so feared and respected? And weren't they supposed to be sages? Northern met Zion's words with an easy, polite response. There's no problem, Ascendant Zion. I can just... His sentence cut off abruptly, his expression darkening into a frown. Almost immediately, Zion reacted, his sharp brown eyes narrowing, his stance subtly shifting, guarded. There was a shift in the air. Not just any shift, but one laced with danger. A silent, suffocating pressure settled over the night, thick and oppressive. Northern narrowed his eyes, a dark frown creasing his face. A rift. But it wasn't just about the rift. There was something else, something fundamentally different about it. An anomaly, an evil distortion that made him uncomfortable and extremely wary. As he contemplated what it was, a figure landed heavily on the ground. The impact sent a faint tremor through the air. Tall and powerfully built, the man stood bare-chested, his sculpted muscles shifting with each breath. A deep blue skirt-like garment fluttered around his legs in the night breeze. His hair, the same striking shade of blue, framed his strong features, while two thick bracelets circled each of his rigidly defined biceps. His breathing was slow but forceful, his entire body rising and falling with each measured inhale. Northern studied the man's back, his wariness deepening. He didn't need to peek to gauge the stranger's strength. He could feel it radiating off him in waves, an undeniable force saturating the space between them. Still, he peeked anyway, and what he saw only confirmed what he already knew. Profile. Name: Ryugen Rama. True name: Severed Waves. Attributes: Currents. Soul rank: Transient. Soul core saturation: High. Talent: Undulating Waves. Talent class: SS. Talent ability: Ocean Waves, Wave Sense, Wind Waves, Sound Waves, Charge Waves. Just as his aura suggested, this man was serious bad news. He could control waves, not just ocean waves but all forms of them, tangible and intangible alike. Northern exhaled sharply. There really are monsters in this world. I might have gotten complacent. There were countless nobles he had never met. He had yet to cross paths with his brothers and sisters from the Riemgard Empire, let alone its emperor and empress. He hadn't even stepped outside this continent. So many powerful figures existed in the shadows, their strength beyond what he had ever considered. It became clear, though the academy he was, in truth, it had been nothing more than a dilution of the raw power that ran deep in the Central Plains. Northern felt an unexpected tinge of disappointment. The academy was nothing but a cage. But of course, this man had nothing to do with the rift. He was either Roma's brother or father, someone who had been traveling this way and had landed here for the same reason Northern and Ascendant Zion were now on high alert. And then, the sky shattered. A deep, guttural rip tore through the darkness, like fabric being torn apart by unseen claws. Northern looked up and immediately grimaced. What in the world is that? The night sky twisted, rippling like disturbed water, then split apart. Something massive pushed through. Charred fingers plunged from the rift, grotesquely long, moving unnaturally as they groped their way further out. The hand continued to extend, forcing the sky to tear wider, ripping through like a giant escaping from beneath suffocating blankets. The sheer size of it cast an enormous shadow over Lithia. The man standing before them turned slightly, his sharp eyes scanning the horror unraveling above. I am Ryugen Rama. I'm here in search of my sister. But that can wait. Because whatever the hell is crawling out of that rift isn't going to let me take her and leave in peace. He cracked his knuckles. You all can call me Severed Waves. Now! His gaze lifted to the grotesque hand still forcing its way into reality. How do we deal with this damn monster? Northern's eyes remained locked onto the monstrosity clawing its way free. The rift widened further. And with it, smaller things began to drop from the gaping wound in the sky. They rained down like meteors, striking the ground with devastating force. Cracks ran like veins through the earth upon impact. Then they moved. Northern's gaze sharpened. They looked human, almost. Their bodies were blackened, burned beyond recognition. But they had no features. No eyes.
No mouths.
Just charred husks of existence. And as soon as they landed, they launched themselves at the nearest people. Screams erupted as drifters in the area engaged them immediately, blades flashing, energy igniting in bursts of resistance. Yet Northern remained still, watching. The three of them stood there, unmoving, eyes trained on the unfolding chaos. Then, with a measured voice, he finally spoke. I don't know how exactly we plan to defeat these monsters. His eyes narrowed. But each of their maelstrom. His gaze lifted back to the monstrous hand still emerging from the rift. And that enormous thing trying to break free. That's a Leviathan. A heavy silence settled between them. Ascendant Zion's expression darkened. Severed Waves' jaw tightened as he slowly turned to face Northern, his face unreadable. But in his eyes, there was no mistaking it. This battle was about to get ugly. Chapter 853. Down below. A Leviathan. A Leviathan. A damned Leviathan. How exactly were they supposed to defeat a Leviathan? The good part was the Leviathan was a disastrous one. Like hell that makes any difference. Northern clenched his teeth angrily as he snatched a broken rock from the ground. He hurled his arm backward, the very wind seeming to part like frightened children before his hand, as it tore forward, sending the stone whistling through the air. Nearby, one of those burnt abominations raised its clawed hands, poised to carve down on a female drifter who shielded a young girl. Her weapon had shattered from blocking the creature's claws twice, and now her death loomed inevitable. She folded down, accepting her demise with horror etched across her face. Fortunately for her, the killing blow never came. Instead, the creature's head suddenly snapped to the side with a shockwave that rippled through the air like a stone dropped in still water. It stumbled several steps sideways, nearly collapsing, but like some undying nightmare, it eerily straightened and slowly turned toward the source of the projectile. Northern had already moved. Just as the creature's head turned, his hand engulfed its face and drove it ruthlessly to the ground, pulverizing the concrete and launching a spray of stone shrapnel into the air. Northern pinned the creature and glanced at the woman, snarling hurriedly. "Take the child and find safety. A master like you should not be here." His words were crude but accurate. A master had no business killing a maelstrom, although he had been doing it as a nomad, or was it a drifter? He couldn't remember, and sadly lacked the luxury to ponder further. The creature beneath his grip was annoyingly resilient. Northern released his iron hold on the monster, letting it rise. As it did, his leg shot upward like a spring uncoiling, smashing its jaw with the fluid grace of flowing oil. His hands launched forward and landed on the creature with deceptive gentleness. But there was a delivery of force that pulverized the chest of the burnt abomination, leaving a gaping void where its torso had been. Northern had already locked eyes on the next target, and the one after that, and the one beyond. The entire battlefield spread beneath his predatory gaze, and he was about to make his presence known. He scanned the chaos around him. Severed Waves had instructed him, the sage, to help the civilians and ordered Ascendant Zion to follow along. The Ascendant had tried to warn him about making a mistake, but Severed Waves was having none of it. He didn't have time for second opinions and demanded they join Paragon Rizel, wherever he was, to find a way to deal with the Leviathan. Meanwhile, Northern, being a sage, should handle the lesser threats. He had even added the line, "I hope that's not too much to ask of you, young man?" Northern wasn't particularly offended. Offended? Why would I be offended? Yeah, sure, go ahead and take care of the Leviathan. Let's see if you all can do it without me. I'll be watching from down below. And the most annoying part was, the damned man was a sage too. Who the hell throws orders around like they're some big shot? Oh dear Lord. It seems making me mad runs in their family or something. Northern gritted his teeth and caught a charred abomination's claws with primal indignation. As he threw his fiery, cold eyes at the creature, it seemed to falter back a bit, visibly trembling with fear. A spike of black spear erupted from its belly, rooting from the pool of darkness that stretched from Northern's feet to the burned creature. "Congratulations, you have slain." Northern paid no heed to the system's announcement. All he wanted was to end this in one devastating blow, find somewhere to sit, and watch how they'd handle the Leviathan that still struggled to pull itself through the narrow rift. One of its titanic hands had fully emerged, and the vicious pool of darkness that served as its eyes glared down upon the world with a malevolence that Northern had never before witnessed, like an ancient hatred given form and purpose. They sure would be having a blast. Meanwhile, Paragon Rizel frowned on the rooftop, arms folded as he gazed skyward. Sage Mac and one other figure stood behind him, both silently awaiting his command like dutiful shadows. Ascendant Zion, moving as if he had springs infused in his legs, bounced onto the rooftop and sprinted toward the Paragon. Paragon Rizel glanced at him for a moment before shifting his gaze to a man who materialized from subtle ripples in the air, detecting his presence a fraction of a second before he fully appeared. "Sage Rama, how nice of you to show your face in a wasteland such as this. Do you not know that we are doomed for destruction? Don't tell me you've come to be a hero?" Despite the words, Paragon Rizel regarded the man with a deadpan expression, seeming almost displeased. Severed Waves responded with dismissive tone. Oh, save me all that. You know the only reason I can be here. But it doesn't matter right now. You wasted lots seem to have gotten yourself into some dirty nonsense. The paragon turned his eyes back to the sky where the creature struggled to break free. A moment later, a small smile crept across his lips like dawn breaking over a battlefield. Severed Waves frowned slightly. If you have the luxury of a smile before such a disaster, then it must mean I am misunderstanding the situation or underestimating you. Paragon Rizel shrugged. You are not misunderstanding anything or underestimating me. It just so happens that I have a capable mentee. I think this would be a piece of cake if he and I team up. Rizel turned to Ascendant Zion. Where's Ral? I saw him with you a few moments ago. The Ascendant shifted uncomfortably, visibly intimidated. Sage Rama asked him to take care of the mobs. Each one of them is a maelstrom. A master wouldn't be able to deal with them. Paragon Rizel faced Severed Waves, his expression darkening like a sudden storm. Who the hell gives you the authority to give my mentee commands? And why the hell did he even listen to you? That guy sometimes behaves strangely. A moment later, though, Paragon Rizel considered the fact that Sage Rama was Roma's brother. But before he could comment further, a terrifying, ominous darkness descended upon them, causing all to become gravely serious as they shifted their attention to a single point. Down below. Chapter 854, Harbinger of Death. Northern stood at a vantage point, his spatial awareness collecting precise information on every single position of the damned monsters. One was being attacked by two masters, but they weren't having any luck, their weapons on the verge of shattering like glass under pressure. Another plunged its vicious claws into the chest of a drifter, hoisting them up like a grotesque trophy. A third monster charged toward a civilian and three drifters who braced themselves for battle, determination etched on their faces. Three more rushed through the rain, their evil claws poised to shred another victim. All of them seamlessly entered his space of knowing, and the remarkable development was that he didn't even need to open Chaos Eyes. His mundane eyes had long been adapting to Chaos Eyes, inheriting some of its gifts. This heightened spatial awareness was one such blessing. All the information, he simply knew it without having to look. Everything unfurled before his consciousness like a living map. The charred abominations possessed exceptionally resilient skin, allowing them to break weapons with terrifying ease. Several drifters with strength-type talents had their hands grotesquely mangled because they'd attempted to punch through the monsters. This was why Northern had delivered a calculated soft punch and used Return to unleash a tremendous amount of stored impact from the contest battle, while employing Echo to instantaneously multiply it on a single point. That was how he'd killed the creature instantly. Their bodies were nearly impenetrable fortresses, almost unbreakable by conventional means. Another resistance the creatures possessed was against flames. Although Northern doubted they could withstand Sun's legacy, it was a different breed of flames after all. Several drifters had hurled their fire attacks at the creatures only to watch in horror as the monsters strolled through the inferno unfazed, seizing the throats of said drifters and lifting them skyward. They were formidable opponents indeed. Of course, not for Northern. This was precisely what the Black Lance was crafted for, delivering the only kind of cut that could slice through them, like destiny itself made sharp. This time, however, he wanted to deliver a cut that would sever all of the hundreds of maelstrom roaming the entire city in a single slash. That would take a magnanimous effort. It wasn't like the technique he'd developed by watching Ryan. Maybe it was similar but not explicitly the same thing. That was a cut but not a single cut. If he used that kind of technique, countless drifters and civilians would get caught in the crossfire and perish. He didn't want to give a certain person another set of grievances to point fingers at him and nag him about, which was why he chose something stressful, but that would produce a more devastating result. Something he'd contemplated during fleeting moments of his battles. Apparently, not having the easy way out was beginning to force him to use his brain. Northern closed his eyes for a moment and began to release Void Aura. Void Aura was essentially filling the air with a mist of influence. The influence of darkness and emptiness. One that corroded matter and snuffed out fragile lives like wind extinguishing a candle's flame. Releasing such a dangerous aura on a large scale was a terrible thing to do. But after possessing the void aura for so long, Northern now knew how to dilute its effects. What he needed void aura for was to act as a medium of propagation, an intangible body powerful enough to carry a single devastating cleave. And as several drifters struggled, the almost colorless and imperceptible mist flowed outward with terrifying speed, flowing through a drifter's weapon that shattered upon impact with the charred abominations, flowing through a drifter that shielded a civilian, letting the abomination slash wickedly at his exposed back, flowing through another set of drifters, 3 of them, pathetically helpless before the claws of just a single maelstrom, flowing through a mother desperately fleeing with her daughter clutched to her chest, flowing through the empty houses, the abandoned stalls, and the dark, winding streets of Lithia, until all of it was consumed. Northern's eyes gleamed coldly as all of Lithia's space surrendered to the influence of his void. A kingdom claimed without resistance. An eerie blue light glowed in his eyes as he straightened, looking utterly detached from the world. A god passing judgment. Black lance. Cleave it all. At once. The world was sliced. Paragon Rizel trembled slightly and shifted his attention downward as he felt something spreading. The air suddenly grew dark and sinister, a malevolence seeping through the very fabric of reality. That feeling spread with alarming speed. He frowned, contemplating what was unfolding. Then his eyes found his mentee. The strange guy stood undisturbed, unperturbed beside the closest building to the fountain, while he and the others watched from their perch on the roof of the city hall. Seeing Northern, the way he was poised, the Paragon didn't need to feel the darkness emanating from him to know that his distinguished mentee was cooking up something yet again. The sheer thought of it made Paragon Rizel's face light up with pleasant glee, like a proud father witnessing his son's masterpiece. So much so that Severed Waves was visibly confused. The man took a step forward. "Aren't you being too complacent and nonchalant about the things going on in this city? I know that it's doomed for destruction and—" The sage trembled involuntarily. His body shook as a colossal, hollow tear ripped through the night, almost as if the world itself had wielded a blade to cleave the distant ocean, the sound slightly muffled yet unmistakable. His body, even after trembling, still recoiled in fear. Goosebumps spread across his entire skin. His heart felt pierced by an invisible dagger. Every other person had the same reactions, their faces twisted in horror at the terrifying sound that tore across the land. Paragon Rizel, though, was busy grinning like a madman. He stood at the edge of the roof, staring down with unconcealed delight. Then he called out to the rest of them, "Don't be cowards and come see fools." Slowly, hesitantly, the 3 behind him moved forward, their facial expressions a mix of unsureness and wariness as they peered down below. All the charred abominations were dead. In an instant, all of them cleanly severed and left to drown in pools of their fetid black blood. Several drifters and civilians who were just at the edge of death turned around in confusion. The monsters that were about to claim their lives now lay in their own blood, half of their bodies cleanly severed like paper cut by the sharpest blade. And a strange faded black-haired boy stood alone near the fountain, looking up with cold and dangerous blue light gleaming in his eyes, a harbinger of death whose judgment had already been delivered. Chapter 855. Petty. Severed Waves stared down with a horrified expression. His face drained of color, almost turning lilac. He looked as though a deadly headache had seized his mind. What am I seeing right now? Paragon Rizel shifted a chagrined gaze to him. That was what you asked to take care of a mob. The Paragon's voice cut through the air, saturated with disdain. The fact that you have been a sage for more than 10 years does not mean you are the best there is. You and your family have a strange and twisted notion of the progress of power. Indeed, you are respected as sages who can even defeat some ascendants, but you only achieve this because of your overwhelming years of experience. He paused, shifting his gaze to Northern before continuing. This boy here stands as living proof of yours and your father's stupidity. I don't even think he's 20 yet and he has become a sage. Not just any sage, but one that even I am not 100% confident I could defeat without willingly sacrificing some of my limbs and mental health. Sage Rama continued to stare at the said sage, terror etched into every line of his face. How? This is not supposed to be possible. It makes no sense for a child like him to wield such formidable power as a sage. Which family does he hail from? Paragon Rizel's lips curved into a savage grin. None of your business, family damned boy. Get your ass out of my city. Severed Waves inhaled and exhaled heavily, struggling to calm his disturbed mind. His eyes flickered toward Northern before shifting focus to the Paragon. I am sorry. I underestimated someone like that. You know it's not in me to be that rash. The situation was urgent. He frowned darkly and glanced up at the anomaly suspended in the night sky. Horror washed over his features like a tidal wave. I have never faced or seen a Leviathan before. This is seriously bad news, Paragon Rizel, and you cannot afford to be lackadaisical about it. You need all the hands you can get, including mine and my brother's. The Paragon frowned, silent for several heartbeats. His jade-green eyes glowered coldly in the silence. Ascendant Zion moved closer to him and whispered, Severed Waves is right. We need him. Right now, we have no means to contain the situation. And we still have to continue the evacuation amidst all of this. We will definitely need his erratic nature as a distraction to cover our evacuation. The Paragon's green eyes continued to glower dangerously. But after the Ascendant moved away, he smacked his lips and finally the dangerous light dimmed. Don't think I'm deciding to let you stay because of the situation on ground. I am confident in my ability to dissolve the situation without your help. As you have witnessed, I have all that I could ever need. He exhaled and turned away from the man, folding his arms as he retook his initial posture facing the stuck colossal hand. Make yourself useful somehow. I don't care how you do it. Ascendant Zion, fetch me Sage Ral. The Ascendant gulped and responded quickly. Yes, sir. He flashed forward and leaped down the building with the grace of a butterfly, his form vanishing into the chaos below. Northern continued to look up with a cold look in his eyes, grinning inwardly and saying internally, How's that for taking care of the mobs, you darned incompetent sage? The only reason why I am not cutting you down with contempt is because you are Roma's brother. Why did he even care if he was Roma's brother? Strange. That girl has done something very peculiar to me. Remind me not to associate with her anymore. Even though he just said so, Northern was rather unbelieving of himself. Roma had a special allure that made her fun to want to hang out with. She was honest too, and watching her and her nature somehow delighted him. Away with these thoughts. Just as Northern fought for control of his own mind, he saw the handsome and kind Ascendant gliding towards him through the air. Ascendant Zion landed on the ground soundlessly and bowed his head slightly before addressing Northern. Paragon Rizel calls for you. Northern looked around, putting on a sorry expression. Oh, can you tell the Ascendant Severed Waves asked me to take care of the mobs? The Ascendant looked around with an incredulous expression, then returned his brown eyes to Northern. I am sure you have done more than taking care of the mobs, Sage Rian. Northern touched his hand, as if stricken with disheartenment. I can't really say that I have. I made sure to cut everything, but still I have to ensure that the assignment I was given by the sage was done well. Seeing how the Basta, Sage hoped it wouldn't be too much to ask for. Ascendant Zion chuckled softly. It's all right, Sage Rian, you can drop the act. I'm sure after seeing what you just did, regret is eating him up. And Paragon Rizel did not take it easy on him after discovering what he asked you to do. Northern straightened his expression, his brows rising slightly. Really? Northern leaned his head closer with interest. What did the Paragon say to him? Ascendant Zion answered straightforwardly. That he was a nuisance and asked him to leave the city. That he could take care of this disaster with just you. Northern immediately winced. What? Why would Burning Flame do that? I didn't register him as an emotional or sentimental person. This is a damned Leviathan? Who says I am enough? Ascendant Zion let out a pleasant smile. The Paragon can be quite excessive sometimes, but I was with him on this one. Sage Rama was quite rude to you. Power dictates respect in this world, and he crossed the line. His smile shone beautifully, and you were wise to neglect it and act intelligently. Act intelligently? Who's he talking to? Northern was lost for a moment. But do not worry. I managed to convince the Paragon not to send Sage Rama away. Now, he needs you so we can figure out what to do about that hand. Ascendant Zion completed his statement, pointing to the sky. Northern glanced up and sighed. Fine, let's go. Northern suddenly stopped as a terrifying pressure shook his entire being. Ascendant Zion also trembled, almost crumbling to his knee with a very white face and widened eyes. The tear in the sky widened slightly, like a wound being forced apart by unseen fingers. A few more charred creatures began to drop through the gash. But this time they were different. The sheer speed of their fall tore through the sound barrier several times, and as each landed, the sound of a colossal crash rippled through the city. Shockwaves spread outward, upheaving the ground like massive stones dropped into still water, sending violent ripples across the cityscape. Chapter 856. Trapped in Inertia. Northern stood frozen. A dark grimace etched across his face as the creatures continued to descend. Their numbers weren't as vast as the initial waves, but quantity wasn't the issue. The true problem lurked in their nature. Each of these charred monstrosities falling from above was a catastrophic destroyer. Their anatomy resembled the first wave of hazardous maelstrom, yet distinct differences marked them as something far worse. Their skins, blackened and featureless like coal that had burned beyond recognition, gave them the appearance of living nightmares as they stalked through Lithia City's shattered remains. From their heads twisted a single horn, slender and sharp as a dagger. Where eyes should have been, only hollow sockets gaped, somehow more terrifying than any gaze could have been. The moment their feet touched the ground, the wind itself seemed to cower. A silence, heavy as death, blanketed the ruined city of Lithia. Ascendant Zion stood frozen, trembling visibly as he watched the abominations. His face twisted with revulsion, skin blanching with each passing moment. Sage Rian, what do we do? They feel like destroyers, and the pressure I'm feeling from them, they have to be at least catastrophic, right? His voice quivered like a leaf in autumn wind. Northern glanced at the Ascendant, the corner of his mouth curving upward. You are very right. The handsome Ascendant stared at Northern, color draining further from his already pallid face, pupils thinning to pinpoints. Are you smiling? Northern's lips had indeed formed an unmistakable grin. Yes. Should I cry instead? The Ascendant shifted his weight, his limbs betraying his terror. Not exactly. I just expected your demeanor to be more grave. These are walking destroyers. Everyone here is doomed, including sages. No one can battle these monstrosities. Ascendant Zion spoke truth. Destroyers were nightmares given form. Even facing mere maelstrom, the drifters of Lithia had faltered and required rescue. Bodies lay scattered across the ground like broken dolls. Civilians and drifters alike, their final expressions frozen in horror. Soon more would join them, feeding the crimson pool that seeped into the city's cobblestone roads like hungry roots. Northern's gaze turned vacant for several heartbeats, his eyes losing focus as if peering into another realm, one of thousand thoughts. The charred destroyers remained motionless, an unsettling silence hanging in the air. They twisted their necks gradually, joints creaking like ancient, rusted hinges. The city streets stood eerily quiet, not from absence of life but from its hiding. Citizens cowered in shadowed alleys, dark corners, and within buildings, breath held tight in constricted lungs. Northern exhaled deeply, his eyes snapping back to clarity. This is what we are going to do, Ascendant Zion. As he spoke, he stepped forward. Lustrous black armor materialized around his body like liquid shadow solidifying, a sword manifesting in his grip, as if plucked from the depth of the wind. I will deal with all of them. I want you to focus on evacuating the civilians to the illusionary haven. At that moment, One abomination swiveled toward Northern, its head twitching erratically like a broken mechanism. Despite its hollow eye sockets, it seemed to fixate on something with unnerving intensity. Northern's face disappeared behind the night terror helmet, for azure eyes burning through the visor like cold stars, his twisted horn jutting forth like a crown of malice. The creature lurched forward, launching itself with blistering speed. But it never reached Northern. Suddenly, the creature suspended in mid-air, frozen in its deadly trajectory. Northern, already poised to swing his sword, faltered in confusion. A heartbeat later, recognition dawned on him as he sensed a familiar presence. Crazy Paragon. Wham! Too swift for the eye to track, something crashed into the abomination, seized it, and hurled it backward in one fluid motion. Crimson hair blazed like wildfire against the wind as he transformed into a mere blur, materializing beside the charred destroyer. His fist sliced through air with devastating precision and connected with the creature, the impact reverberating like thunder against the bedrock of the world itself. The Paragon's face hardened into stone as he locked the abomination in place. His hands became weapons, striking from the flank and crushing into the creature's side, though its form held firm. Another strike surged upward, smashing into the creature's jaw and snapping its head backward with sickening force. The raw power behind each blow should have launched the creature skyward. Each strike carried the weight of mountains, compressing into pinpoint devastation. Yet the abomination remained suspended in the same space, as if chained to that point in reality. Trapped in inertia, a perfect target for the Paragon's relentless assault. Strangely, the other abominations stood motionless, like statues carved from nightmares. Northern's mind clicked with sudden realization. He did something. The Paragon had indeed enacted something, but Northern couldn't pinpoint when. The abominations had exhibited peculiar behavior from the start, only their heads rotating when they first arrived, none advancing a single step forward, with just one responding when Northern moved. He had dismissed it as typical monster oddity. Even the rift's sudden appearance was unusual, though not entirely unprecedented. It reminded Northern of those rifts that had torn through the dark continent, but such reflections would have to wait. This pressure, this power, the shift in air, as if time itself hangs suspended. This must be it.
Essence manifestation.
Northern suspected it but lacked certainty. Was this truly an essence manifestation, or merely one of Burning Storm's talent abilities? Yet even as a talent ability, trapping multiple monsters in a single space of motion was extraordinary. Oh, he's definitely powerful. One final blow thundered through the air, a crescendo of destruction that dwarfed all that came before. The Paragon stepped back, his face contorted with rage, as the dismantled head and body of the abomination collapsed into a heap of ruin. He shook his hand vigorously, knuckles unbroken but bones screaming in protest. These bastards are tough. Tougher than anything I've ever smashed. Northern's eyes stretched wide with disbelief. He killed it with his bare fists? Paragon Rizel pivoted and strode toward them, the air around him crackling with heat like the aftermath of a lightning strike. A controlled tempest swirled around his form as he approached. His gaze locked onto Ascendant Zion and Northern with piercing intensity. Both of you focus on moving the civilians. I will handle this. Ral, stay vigilant. If luck abandons us, the next downpour might bring behemoths. We'll need plenty of your mistakes this time around. The Paragon's lips curled into a savage grin as he turned toward the next trapped destroyer, dismissing them with a casual wave while advancing toward the doomed creature. Chapter 857, Because He is Burning Storm. Northern continued to glance back even as he helped the people and guided them towards the rift. All of the abominations, the damned destroyers, stood motionless in a single place, as though rooted to the ground with no interest to move. The only part of their bodies that struggled to break free from the inertia was their heads, which shifted left and right like corrupted data, glitching between reality and destruction. No matter how close he ventured to them, they remained frozen, defiant statues in a battlefield of destruction. And Burning Storm lurked among them, picking them off one by one, unleashing terrible devastation upon each destroyer. Northern watched as Burning Storm's fists blurred with power, leaving craters of destruction in their wake. The air itself seemed to tremble with each impact. There were probably over 30 of these charred creatures, yet Burning Storm took his time, methodically moving from one to another. His bare fists punched through their hardened exteriors while his control of their stationary force kept them pinned. They could neither flee nor retaliate against him. He had frozen the entire battlefield and commanded absolute control over it. Northern could have slaughtered a bunch of destroyers without breaking a sweat, especially counting his clones. He could also have obliterated all of them with a single strike if he decided to use Sun's legacy. But memories of the aftermath the last time he used that talent made him hesitate, caution dripping from his thoughts like cold water. Lithia would never survive such power unleashed. Paragon Rizel's method, although painstakingly slow, worked with brutal efficiency. Moreover, time wasn't even a concern. While Burning Storm dealt with the charred destroyers, the other drifters, led by Northern and Ascendant Zion, coordinated the civilians toward the gate to the illusionary haven. Still, Northern couldn't help but marvel at the terrifying power the man displayed. The air around Burning Storm shimmered with barely contained energy, like heat waves rising from scorched earth. What made it more unsettling was that he wasn't even showing his full strength. Since his slots was full, he didn't get notifications to copy talents anymore, so Northern couldn't determine if this was explicitly Essence manifestation or if Burning Storm was using his talent. But he sensed that the concept of Burning Storm's Essence manifestation was somehow woven into his inertia trapping. And the man showed no signs of fatigue. Several queues formed from different areas in the city, civilians with hopeless, terrified expressions marching toward the illusionary haven. Their footsteps created a rhythm of desperation against the broken ground. Many glanced at Burning Storm with bewildered expressions, sparks of hope igniting in some eyes. But this did little to dispel the somber wind that whispered through the night air. Who could blame them for their hopelessness and dejection? A leviathan still loomed overhead. Thanks to its massive size, the creature struggled to reach them, and the rift itself seemed to have stretched to its limit. The beast's enormous shadow blanketed them in darkness, constantly reminding them of the danger above. And the abyssal eyes of the creature that stared down at them from the veil of the rift weren't those of a being willing to retreat and try another day. There was a stubbornness in those unreadable, lightless eyes, a determination that made Northern avoid looking upward, because whenever he did, it felt as though the sky itself might crash down upon them at any moment, crushing their fragile hopes beneath cosmic weight. Still, the evacuation progressed, although Northern felt uneasy moving so many people beneath the lightless gaze of a colossal leviathan. But they had no choice, the evacuation had to continue. Ascendant Zion glanced at him, his brown eyes studying Northern's expression. "You seem a little tense." Northern frowned at the man instantly. "And you're not? Wait, what am I even saying? Weren't you the one quivering like you had frostbite a moment ago?" The Ascendant's lips curved into a smile. "Well, your earlier calm demeanor helped me settle a bit, and the Paragon coming to take care of things personally is very reassuring." Northern shifted his gaze to Burning Storm, who stood at some distance, gripping another charred destroyer by the shoulder as he repeatedly pummeled its stomach. Each blow sent shockwaves through the air. "You must have a lot of faith in him." The handsome Ascendant raised a brow, somehow making his visage even more striking. "Of course I do. Everyone here does. He is Burning Storm." Northern squinted, tilting his head in silent contemplation of Ascendant Zion's words. After a beat of silence, he asked, "That's the thing. Why?" "Because he's a paragon." Ascendant Zion chuckled, shaking his head. "What? No. Not because he's a paragon, but because he's Burning Storm." Northern stared at him, his expression blank, uncomprehending. Ascendant Zion studied Northern for a moment, his brown eyes gleaming with respect as he explained. "Look, I've been in many fights with Paragon Rizel before, and I've never seen him get tired." Northern folded his arms, tilting his head back at the Ascendant. "You mean figuratively or literally?" "I'm talking literally, brother. I have never seen Paragon Rizel tire during or after a fight. He never rests. Ascendant Zion shifted his gaze to the Paragon, who had moved onto another abomination and was repeatedly smashing its featureless face with his knee. The creature's form shuddered with each impact, yet remained suspended in place by invisible forces. The same energy that Burning Storm started with still radiated from him. If anything, he seemed even more invigorated. And the truth was, even Northern himself had observed it. The Paragon showed no signs of fatigue whatsoever. Northern focused more intently on Paragon Rizel, watching how he grabbed one limb with one hand, another with his other hand, and forcibly twisted both in opposite directions simultaneously. It took a while, but both eventually snapped off the charred destroyer, leaving it armless yet still immobile, like a grotesque statue in a museum of horrors. The Paragon unleashed a powerful forward kick, his foot crashing into the chest of the abomination with devastating force, momentarily granting it freedom to soar through the air before it became stationary mid-flight, frozen in time and space. Then the Paragon vanished from his position again, a blur of movement too fast to track. Ascendant Zion continued. Do you see it? Paragon Rizel never tires, and this isn't about being hardworking or having a resilient spirit. No doubt, those qualities contribute to the formidable man he is today. But this is about his talent more than anything, I guess. Northern's eyes gleamed with desperate longing as he watched the Paragon and absorbed Ascendant Zion's explanation. His fingers clenched unconsciously at his sides. He wanted it. He wanted that talent with a hunger that gnawed at his core. He had never coveted a talent more than this one. Simultaneously, another wave of rain threatened to begin. This one made the night ripple with a hollow sound, something that resembled the cry of a demented whale. A sound that burrowed into the marrow of their bones and made even the bravest among them shiver involuntarily. Chapter 858. Dedicate Your Hearts. Northern and Ascendant Zion stared upward, their expressions crumbling like ancient ruins. Ascendant Zion's face had blanched to a shade whiter than Northern's. Since night had fallen, the sky was already dark, but normally stars glittered like scattered diamonds against the blanket of the sky, and the twin moons, each a crescent carved toward the other, would cast a shower of pale light upon the world. During winter, night was usually not as dark as in autumn or summer. Even the cold wind had a way of illuminating its surroundings with a crystalline quality. The sky shouldn't be as dark as it was right now. But darkness had swallowed everything, as if a thick blanket of shadow had spilled from the rift and engulfed the entire sky in one hungry gulp. Northern and the Ascendant did not need to be told what was going to happen next. Crappy rain. Could have really chosen another time, Northern muttered, his voice tight despite the casual words. Ascendant Zion chuckled forcibly, the sound brittle as thin ice. I find it unbelievable that you still have room for humor in this importunate situation. Northern, dark lines forming on his face like cracks in marble, glanced at the Ascendant. Importunate. I am quite enamored that you still have the luxury of thoughts to conjure such peculiar words in this importunate situation. His lips curled into a grin that never reached his eyes. Ascendant Zion froze with shock, not quite surprise. He was rather amazed and found it hard to comprehend the young man before him, whose courage stood defiant against the coming storm. But that's not quite the word you'd use in that context. Northern fixed him with a deadpan expression, his eyes cold as winter stones. Tell me, do I look like I care? The Ascendant shifted his gaze away, unable to hold that penetrating stare. Not exactly. Northern exhaled, his breath a small cloud in the chill air, and looked around. Paragon Rizel was dealing with yet another destroyer, crashing the burnt thing into the ground with his leg. The impact sent shrapnel of debris flying through the air like deadly confetti, before he stomped on it ruthlessly. He still had several more destroyers lined up, like crates of eggs waiting to be cracked and fried for a hearty, satisfying dinner. Northern returned his attention to the sky. We can't afford to let this get to the Paragon. We have to take care of it before it lands. Ascendant Zion's voice cracked with panic. We? Take care of it before it lands? Even when it lands, we can't even fight a behemoth. How do we take care of it before it lands? Northern turned to the Ascendant with a confused frown folding his brows. Who was talking to you? Ascendant Zion trembled with embarrassment and stepped back, looking around to see who Northern could possibly be addressing. Behind Northern stood a lady with a red spear. Her hair was short and brown, her eyes hollow as if she was sleep-deprived. She wore sleek silver armor that accentuated her body and curves, gleaming faintly in the darkness. She stared upward with intensity etched into the serious frown on her face. There was another man next to her with ashen, rough hair and a face contorted with rage. Ascendant Zion almost felt he could suffer bruises just from looking at the man's expression. But those were only the beginning. A shadow of dark flame expanded beneath Northern's feet, and within its sinister depths, things began to crawl out. First came a goat. Ascendant Zion did not know what a goat was, but the creature that emerged first from the dark flames was both absurd and unsettling. Its rectangular pupils fixed on the sky with an intelligence no ordinary animal should possess. Its silver body gleamed beautifully under the light cast by the destruction raging through the city and that emanating from the gate of the illusionary haven. Berg. Ascendant Zion almost jumped out of his skin when he heard the voice. It was a funny and eerily casual sound. He had never heard a creature sound so unserious before. But before he could dwell further on the goat, another creature emerged. This one carried itself with more dignity and pristine elegance than the goat. His white cloak flowed out like a river of moonlight carried through the air by invisible currents. He carried a silver sword, his golden gauntlet hand resting atop the hilt as he walked out of the dark flames with a regal air. The next was a lithe black creature with slit eyes and lean muscles. Jagged white lines traced across its body, and it stood with a sinister presence that made Ascendant Zion stagger back involuntarily. Black Mamba did not care a bit about the weird human staring, or at least did not seem to. He simply walked to Northern's back, positioning himself closest to his master. Some words slithered from his mouth with effort. My Lee. Edge. Northern smiled and glanced back. It's nice to see you getting better with speech. Then he returned his gaze to the sky. The darkness that veiled it rippled slightly, and Northern suspected the creatures would start dropping any moment now. But Black Mamba was rather preoccupied, his lips curling upward in an attempt to mirror the exact smile he had caught on his liege's face. Other summons had already crawled out as well. Revunt, Byran, and lastly Night Terror, who took position at Northern's right side, his crimson devilish four eyes gleaming with silent madness. The dark flames retreated and disappeared completely. Empty Fluffy was not joining the battle today. Northern wanted to give him and Corpse Eater enough time for recuperation. These ones were quite healed already. Northern's expression hardened into grave seriousness. Okay, the plan is simple. All of them. Kill them before they land. Use whatever means you can, but they must not land. An insane and daring grin formed on his face. He glanced back to see all of his void summons gleaming with such menace that he almost got the chills himself. He turned forward again with renewed confidence, his grin widening. Dedicate your hearts. Then he flew. Chapter 859. Battle of Behemoths, Part 1. Northern's body cut through the air like a blade, cleaving the atmosphere as he soared higher into the sky, his figure blurring with velocity. In a heartbeat, he halted abruptly and fixed his gaze on the rift with its strange blanket of darkness looming above the city, partially veiling the sky in an eerie mist. He furrowed his brows as he studied the rift. The massive burnt hand of the abomination hung lazily outside, resembling a titan that had failed to squeeze through a tiny hole, its colossal hand trapped in the breach, unable to retreat inside yet incapable of fully emerging. The whole scene defied logic and reason. Everything about rifts and monsters was inherently unnatural, but that unnaturalness had, in this world, become a twisted kind of normal. So within that new normal, this situation stood out as particularly wrong. Very, very wrong. Several possibilities could explain this anomaly. One theory eclipsed the others in its strangeness, yet Northern had grounds to believe it. The foundation of his suspicion was the fact that Ruffsburg and certain paragons had managed to manually create the appearance of rifts through some wicked spell art. This tampering had triggered repercussions that probably only Northern knew about, and even his understanding remained murky. What he did know was that instability now plagued the boundary between the underworld and Trael, and as this instability grew, "I don't know what's going to happen, but it's going to be catastrophic." At least that much he recalled deducing from his conversation with Sura. Now, if Dante somehow is replicating this process, or if he's collaborating with Ruffsburg, Northern's eyes narrowed to slits at the thought. To hell with wishes. He wouldn't forgive anyone endangering the world for their selfish desires. Dante might proclaim his intention to revolutionize the world, to usher in a new era, but ultimately, didn't he just want to stand above it all? I guess humans truly are selfish at their core. Yet strangely, Northern found himself thinking of one person who seemed to defy this fundamental trait. He frowned at the realization. Seriously, did I crack my skull on a rock? But when he considered it with an unbiased mind, giving Raven the benefit of doubt and attempting to understand without his preconceptions, the truth became apparent. Or at least seemed so. Her actions brought her no personal gain. She was a social recluse like him. In fact, he suspected her condition might be worse than his own. With her power she could easily have led, but she chose not to, because she understood what people needed versus what they should receive. For someone who had united everyone through her strength, molding them into a single, cohesive mind, assuming leadership would have been both satisfying and responsible. But Raven wasn't like that. She worked closely with Sage Gilbert for everyone's betterment in Lothellowen, while simultaneously pursuing a greater goal. All this without any visible personal benefit, at least none that Northern could discern. She fought relentlessly, committed terrible acts so the people could escape that land of destruction, and then decided to surrender herself as a prisoner. Someone who would shoulder the burden and weight of all sins while the people returned to their homes. Being a devoted fangirl, Terence probably anticipated her intentions and would never allow Raven to walk that path. At least not alone. Yet this didn't alter the fact that Raven demonstrated true selflessness in everything she did. Have I been viewing this all wrong? Of course he had. Anger had clouded his judgment. It was impossible to see anything clearly when drowning in resentment toward it. But all of that still remained buried in the fact that she used him, even if it was for her selfless goal. Telling him plainly about the destruction of the ship would have been better. Of course, at that time he probably wouldn't have gone. But it still would have been better. Northern let out a sardonic chuckle and then materialized the illusion hefter. He fixed his gaze on the rift that was now rippling yet again. Something was emerging from its depths. Northern could see the burnt skin, tearing out of the little space left around the trapped hand. With a little more effort, the first one managed to break through. What Northern saw made his eyes widen with cold horror. As the charred creature tore out of the rift, it unfurled something that resembled a decrepit wing. Actually, a burnt wing would be more accurate. The feathers looked like those of a ruined bird that had somehow survived an undulating inferno, viciously long and thin, sleek and seemingly efficient for flight. Two of them spread out like heralds of imminent death. At that moment, Northern shook his head. Why the hell is my luck so terrible? The point of his plan to trap them mid-flight was to prevent them from freely moving and attacking the civilians escaping into the rift. But the moment these damned behemoths started having wings, that plan now stood like a table with 3 legs. It wasn't impossible, but it would demand a greater effort from him. Northern gritted his teeth. What bad luck, you miserable bastards. Northern stifled the rest of the curse as he plunged through the air, shooting towards the behemoth that was already diving down with frightening speed. The creatures were charred through and through. The first wave had no facial features, the next wave had hollow eyes, and this wave seemed to have burnt, grotesque maws hidden behind broken beaks that made them look like they were perpetually grinning, albeit one hell of an ugly grin. Instead of a pair of gruesome limbs with devious talons, the charred behemoths possessed 3 pairs of these monstrous appendages. And devious was an understatement for their talons. They curved like scythes forged specifically to harvest the souls of any creature they encountered. Before Northern could engage one, something streaked past him. A black sinister trail of steel that flashed across the air as the figure rolled past the winged behemoth before momentarily suspending in free fall. One of the creature's wings separated with a sickening spray of black ichor. Night Terror landed on a rooftop below, for curved blades carved from shadows clutched in each hand. Without pausing for breath, he launched himself skyward, catastrophically destroying the slate tiles beneath him. Everything around the launch point shattered and disintegrated in the terrible shockwave that radiated outward as Night Terror soared into battle. Chapter 860. Battle of Behemoths, Part 2. Northern had never doubted how strong Night Terror was. But there were certain limitations he had built up in his mind for the monster, barriers that the devilish creature just kept shattering like glass. Northern had never imagined Night Terror wielding swords. He was a grotesque monster with 16 vicious claws, and that was all there was to him. A savage beast to his very core. Not cutesy, not elegant, not demure. He was an outright, unpolished, ruthless predator. However, at some point he began to move with grace and intention, which didn't diminish his ruthlessness but somehow unsettled Northern to his core. He used to be so. Man, he's grown. Northern watched as Night Terror sliced through the sky with impossible speed and swung his hands in a meticulous, hypnotic pattern. His first upper two hands crossed each other in deadly arcs, while the lower two hands mirrored the same motion but in reverse, pulling away from each other, finishing the remaining behemoth's wing with a ruthless slice and carving another wound across its chest, though that one was shallow. Before Night Terror could tear himself away from the creature, 6 powerful limbs latched onto him. The behemoth's long neck curved backward like a tensed bowstring, its ugly broken maws snapping wide open with a bone-chilling cry as it lunged forward, desperate to tear a chunk from Night Terror. Before its head could connect, another black flash streaked across the sky. The same rolling move that Night Terror had performed. The creature unfurled mid-fall, its 4 hands each clutching curved black swords. Its narrowed white eyes gleamed wickedly as it studied the winged creature with cold savagery. Wow! Northern's eyes widened, sparkling with awe. These bastards! They really have grown tremendously. Black Mamba landed on the rooftop of another building, his cold eyes still wickedly gleaming. Northern sensed something in the creature's gaze. A silent focus, something desperate, longing, yearning. Like a hunter finding an essential puzzle piece, wanting to complete what was started. Black Mamba crouched and catapulted himself into the air again. Although his takeoff wasn't as destructive as Night Terror's, it still sent tremors through the entire building. He latched onto another creature while Night Terror soared past Northern and collided with another winged behemoth that was hurtling toward him. Invisible cuts separated the creature instantly, causing different parts of its body to fall in a macabre rain of black blood. Night Terror descended upon the next creature, gripping it with 2 hands while using his other 2 to shred the creature's skin apart, his black sword dissolving into mist. Although it took more effort than expected, and by the time Northern glanced away, the tough hide hadn't yet yielded to the assault. The next summon that seized Northern's awe was Light of Featherstone. Siegfried moved as a streak of radiance flowing through the air with celestial grace. The regal knight darted too swiftly to track, gliding seamlessly like pristine water through the night wind. His elegant flow, however, harbored destruction. His sword couldn't split the abomination's skin with a single strike, but something about each blow drove the creatures to insidious madness, fixating their gazes upon him as they relentlessly pursued the luminous streak. Because of this distraction, a large portion of the winged behemoths broke from their uniform formation, desperately chasing after the Light of Featherstone but never catching him. This strategic diversion made combat easier for the others. First came Shard Creeper. The Void Goat simply landed on an abomination and instantly immobilized it, then leapt to another and froze it in place. All victims remained trapped in horrifying illusions spawned from their own memories. As Shard Creeper jumped to another behemoth, Linus followed through, silver wings like crystalline glass fluttering in the wind, effortlessly carrying him from target to target. His strikes pulsed with ruthless ferocity, working in tandem with his talent to render things brittle before shattering them like glass. This talent carried various strengths and limitations, though it had grown exceptionally potent after Linus recently ascended to savant status during the battle with the floor boss in the dungeon. The remaining creatures were contained by Jesai, Byran, and Revunt. Jesai couldn't accomplish much alone, so she worked in harmony with Byran, essentially riding the slipstream of the Sword King. She followed him with sleek precision, either darting from his side to thrust her spear in supporting strikes or crashing into another abomination before letting the Sword King follow with the finishing blow. The Sword King himself lacked nothing. Each movement flowed with terror's essence, his blade defying distance with deceptive reach. He advanced with that characteristic drowsy gaze, occasionally opting to drive his elbow into the maws of an abomination, seize its neck, pivot, and hurl it at Revunt. Revunt would glower wickedly before catching the abomination and drenching it in an ocean of palpable despair. The creature would literally shrink before his eyes, its blood drying out with a sickening hiss as Revunt exhaled. Several creatures actively avoided him. An invisible shroud of despair cloaked Revunt, making him unapproachable. Not that he seemed to care. He appeared and vanished through the air at will, materializing wherever he pleased. Toward any location where he might emerge, Byran would invariably hurl abominations. Sometimes, moments before Revunt reappeared, 3 behemoths were already sailing through the air toward his position. For the tyranny of despair, dispatching enemies required minimal effort. No matter how incomplete a tyrant he might be, he existed on a level apart from the others, isolated in his terrible power. All he needed to kill a creature was to remove his white gloves and hold it in his grasp. Any creature that lingered in his presence was doomed to suffer terribly from a harrowing wound that drained their soul. When he clutched them directly, that intangible assault became viciously tangible, drying out not just their soul but their physical form as well. Being the tyranny of despair, Revunt's ability transcended the morphological composition of monsters. It cared nothing for how tough or resilient their skin might be. Despair bypassed such nonsense and feasted directly on the soul itself. Northern surveyed the choreography of chaos his void summons wove around him. He hadn't even made his entrance yet, and already the battle seemed to be drawing to a close. He grinned with satisfaction. This is good, really good. If you want access to fast updates or the full novel in high-quality audio, contact me now and buy. I offer over 300 complete audiobooks from Pocket FM, Webnovel, Audible, and more. No locked episodes, no subscriptions, just one-time payment via PayPal or Ko-fi. Message me directly on Telegram or WhatsApp, or check out the full list of available novels on Discord. Start listening to your next favorite audiobook today.